What's up, everybody? I'm Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads, and with me I have Jake Payne, and together this is our What's the Headline podcast. How you doing, man?
Yo, man, I'm straight sick with it. We're to E40, but I'm happy to be here. We've taken a couple weeks off, and as I say every time, I start to miss it. How are you doing, though?
Yeah, I'm great, man. I'm great. Got a full night's sleep last night, feeling fresh. Sorry to hear about your cold, but often, we do our best work when we're sick,
Flu game, yeah, man.
Flu
And I
game.
did take the I used one of my disposable tests. It's not the other C word. So I'm good, man. This is my first cold in over 2 years. So, as they say, I was due.
Word. Well, your voice is even more Barry White than usual. Got a little
I feel
Isaac Hayes smoke to it now too. So
somewhere between Tom Waits and Macy Gray, man.
Word. Well, we did take a week off last week, and I'm glad that we did. So full transparency, this entire episode is going to be devoted to Slaughterhouse and the things that have been going on with Joell Ortiz, Kxng Crooked, over the last couple of weeks, and how that has now pulled Royce 5'9" and Joe Budden into it as well. They have a project coming out on March 11th. That is Joell Ortiz and Kxng Crooked have a joint project, and it's called. What do you remember what it's called?
The Rise and Fall of Slaughterhouse.
Right, The Rise and Fall of Slaughterhouse, which is actually what the headline is going to be. Full. We do the headline typically afterwards, but today we're going to talk about the rise and fall of Slaughterhouse, a timeline, and it's genius title for Joell and Kxng Crooked, and we'll get into all of that later. But things are not good in the house. We started to do it last week, but we did not because we thought that we should wait until the album is released on March 11th so that we can unpack the entire album. But things have happened even in this past week where we said, you know what, we should probably dive into this because it's pretty significant, and so full transparency, this will likely have a coda to it. This will probably have a slight part 2 next week. But there is a lot to discuss about Slaughterhouse this week, and this group is meaningful to us and our audience, such that we think that we should give it its full due as a separate episode. So, with that in mind, what we're going to do is we're going to go through a timeline of the rise of Slaughterhouse, and we're going to talk about the fall of Slaughterhouse too, which has had kind of a culmination over the last couple of days or so. So, you ready to get into it?
Yeah, man, let's do it. And I think even before we kind of ease into the timeline, why do you think people love Slaughterhouse so much? I mean, this is a group that has put out, by my count, 2 albums, an EP, and a couple of mixtapes. And, those albums, while they're loved, that we're not talking about, End of the 36 Chambers, End of the Wu-Tang. We're not talking about heavy stuff like why is it that people hold this group so nearly and dearly?
Man, I think a few reasons. First of all, I think that people love a super group. We were fortunate enough to have last year, Corrupt on behalf of the Horsemen, Killer Priest, Razzcast, and Cannabis. And when MCs who have their own catalog come together like that, especially super lyricists, I think it's exciting for fans of lyrical hip hop. And these are 4 guys who have been relatively underdogs. They've been underground and underdogs, and I say that not to suggest they have not had success, because they've each had tremendous success, and often in different ways, with Royce, independently, and with collaborations with Eminem and with Prime. Joell has been a very consistent MC, for the entirety of his career, always putting out great things, sometimes collaborations independently. Crook, I think, is one of the most talented, most lyrical rappers out there, always destroys every track he touches. And Budden really had, he had a gigantic hit to start his career. then went underground with mood music and kind of changed up his entire presentation. And then now, it's probably the most well-known of the group, but for his podcasting efforts. So that being said, I still think though that when it comes to emceeing, they've always been underground, with the exception of the Royce and Eminem collaborations, and underdogs to folks, the blue collar dudes who you're from Pittsburgh, so the hard hat and the steel lunchbox. They're that kind of group, and I think people in our space love that kind of group. But what do you think?
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. Maybe not entirely the underground part, but I know your sentiment. I think there's a couple reasons. I think one, Slaughterhouse arrived at a time when hip hop, was a tug of war. It's not lost on me that this group formed in the same period where you had, Lil Wayne's takeover, you had Drake emerge, Kid Cudi, hip hop rap music got very melodic, very R&B. And these are meat and potatoes MCs. To your point too, is kind of a wild bunch. I mean, there's a true hope story that these four MCs came together to do something great. Now, I personally believe they are greater individually than the sum of their parts, and we're going to talk about that. I also believe that the best music they've made individually has all happened for all four MCs since the group formed. The best solo material or collaborative material outside the group has been recently. These guys just keep getting better. And I know Joe, has been retired for almost 5 years, 6 years. But I think that's a big part of it. Also, I mean, you and I spent a recent episode talking about eras, generations of rap. Slaughterhouse to me is a hallmark of what a lot of people call the blog era. I mean, these were MCs that each and every one of them had frustrations with their labels. So they kind of went rogue and started putting out mixtapes and Lucy's and, Crooked Eye with the weekly series. They had this awesome way of dealing directly with the fans as solo artists. So when they came together, it's a callback to a culture. It's sort of like the early 5 Mike albums with The Source. And I think people miss that, and they engage with this music a lot on Not Right, Two Dope Boys, on Smash, Hip Hop DX, different places, Ambrosia for Heads. And you carry that with you. So there's an element of nostalgia there. And also, I mean, the last part for me is these are 4 of the boldest personalities in hip hop. You said, Joe Budden's Media Game. Crooked Eye is one of the most, competitive spirits I've seen in hip hop ever. Royce has this incredible way, sort of like Joe, of being a personality outside of the music. And Joell too is one of the most consistent and prolific MCs. So they've had beefs, they've had turmoils, they've had label battles. If hip hop is a battle league, if it is WWE wrestling, these are 4 distinct personalities that when they come together feel like the ultimate tag team.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the things you said really resonated with me. I think that them coming together kind of supercharged their careers. And I also agree that they're better individually, and that's no knock on Slaughterhouse. Is a testament to what they've been able to do independently. But there's no doubt that this really propelled them at a time when each was not kind of at their peak, and I think they were all able to go on and do greater and bigger things because of this. In some ways, kind of reminds me of Black Star, because Talib and Mos had been rapping prior to Black Star, but when they formed Black Star is when the world took notice. And after that, each one went on to do bigger things than they'd ever done prior to that. And they come back and, and reform, potentially periodically. Supposedly there's that mythic album out there that Madlib produced, supposedly real. And they tease us every once in a while about getting together and then toured and things like that, but have never really, released the project. But, independently, they've been much better because they formed that group. And I think Slaughterhouse has some parallels there.
That's a great analogy. So let's set the stage. I mean, the origin story of Slaughterhouse, by my watch, begins in 2007. And it's interesting because, there's elements to the story that, I didn't even realize at the time, but I had a small hand, and not in Slaughterhouse, but my own career was in the periphery. But if you go to 2007, you know, it's important to know where these four careers were. You know, for Joe Budden, he was 4 years removed from his eponymous debut, an album. You know, I was a fan of Budden from Cutmaster C and Desert Storm mixtapes. I really, really, really value his first album. But at that point, you know, he had been in a kind of an impasse with Def Jam, started to go independent, but hadn't really delivered a solo follow-up outside of mixtapes. So that's Joe. Crooked I is 3 years off of death row. And I became aware of Crooked I through the Caught Up soundtrack. He did a song with the Loonies. And back in the late 90s, if you saw an interview with Corrupt or Daz or Suge Knight, you know, Crooked I was the future. He was on Sway and Tex, Sway and King Tex, This or That album. I mean, he was just this lyrical miracle out of the West Coast, and kind of carrying on that tradition, but had not put an album out. And one of the things he was working on back then is, and it was when I crossed paths with Crooked, he put out this DVD called Life After Death Row, which was kind of his story as an artist that was poised to be the next flagship of a really important label and never got his turn. So that's Crook. Joell that year, I mean, he releases the best piece of music at that time with his debut album, The Brick Bodega Chronicles, which is an interesting project because at the time, everybody was waiting for Joell to release his album on Aftermath. But like King T, Last Emperor, Eve, you know, he was one of those artists, Bishop Lamont, Hitman, that kind of stayed in Dre's wing a little bit too long. And luckily was able to kind of get his walking papers, go independent, and put out a really well-received album through Koch, E1. And at Royce, you know, he was 3 albums deep, 3 mixtapes deep. But Royce, I mean, I think at the time, if you let Royce tell it, I think he was still maybe not sober. You know, he was coming off of beefs, you know, had kind of had public war of words with D12 and just was bumping heads with different people. And while Royce had always been, I feel, heralded, I actually did Street Team on his very first album, Rock City. You know, it kind of had slowed down. So there you are, 2007, 4 guys, all underdogs, arguably underground, very much, you know, what to do. And what happens is 2007, I'm a features editor at All Hip Hop, and All Hip Hop would do these things in New York City called All Hip Hop Week. It was usually in the summer. And this was the year that I actually ended up leaving and going to Hip Hop DX. So I wasn't heavily involved, but I remember meetings where we were talking about having an MC battle of established MCs. One of the names, you know, was Mr. Fab from the West Coast, who's a phenomenal battle MC, freestylist. We reached out to Fonte from Little Brother, and Joe Budden and Royce the 5'9" were 2 other names that came up. And Royce actually told this story, I believe, in a Rap Radar podcast, where he came to New York and thought he was just kind of going to be a rap clinic, and came to find out, I wasn't there that night, that he was supposed to battle. And Joe Budden doesn't.
Let me ask you this: were you actively involved in putting together the event?
No, I can't take credit for that. I mean, shout out to one of my mentors, Chuck Creekmer. But I remember being in New York on 34th Street at meetings where we were like, what are great MCs that would be willing to do this, that aren't going to have label paperwork say they can't perform? And it was, I mean, I think internally we were a little bit wishy-washy of, is this a battle? You know, I wish that Versus existed, because I think that's ultimately what we wanted to have, of kind of a this or that competition from the crowd. And this was, you know, in 2007, I mean, YouTube was out, right?
Yeah. I think it started 2006. Yeah.
I mean, video online is starting to become the big thing if you can afford to produce it and edit it, etc. And somewhere along the line, for whatever reason, I was not at the ultimate event. I think it was at SOB's in downtown.
Wait, so but in the planning though, so you're going back and forth about whether or not it should be like you know, battling a battle of records, shall we say, so going back and forth, you know, performances versus like a true you know, battle, like, you know, like people actually in each other's faces, going at each other and really like getting into it. That was the debate. Yeah,
I mean, it started to get a little bit vague, as I understand it. I wasn't privy where my role ended is just throwing MCs. And I remember being at the meeting where I was like, I think Fonte would be a great idea. I mean, because at the time, Little Brother, Ninth it was around that time when Ninth left the group. And we were just talking about what would work, and trying to get all different regions and pockets of hip hop fans represented. But if you think about it, you got Royce from Michigan, Budden right there in Jersey, Fonte down south, Fab from the West Coast. There were other names. And then at that point, it must have been late summer. I wasn't at the event, but if you let Royce tell it, this is actually a direct quote I'll read. He says, "Bro, I got myself into a situation. I was in a battle with Mr. Fab." And the quote, he alludes to, Fonte being involved and backing out when he learned it was a rap battle. Joe Budden was on the bill, but reportedly stepped away due to a family emergency. The battle was hosted by Craig G. Royce says that he is not a freestyle MC and was not prepared to battle Fab. Direct quote now, "Mr. Fab smoked me. I did not have anything written for the battle, so I was just doing regular raps and ish. Shout out to Chuck Creekmer, because he told me I wasn't coming to a battle. He told me something totally different. I got there and was just ambushed." Now, Royce in that conversation did add that, he and Chuck remain friends, as of course I do and Chuck.
Yeah,
that event.
Wait, let's set the table too a little bit on Mr. Fab, because if folks recall, anyone who followed the Royce Lupe skirmish that happened last year will recall that Lupe brought up the fact that Royce took an L from Mr. Fab. Now, Mr. Fab, an Oakland MC, incredible freestyler, one of the best I've ever seen. Him, Supernatural, King Los. There are only a select number of MCs who can really go off the top like that and make it sound incredible, string together themes, paragraphs, the whole nine. Mr. Fab is one of those dudes. He's also a battle rapper. So if Royce, who is a guy who's used to writtens and, one of the sharpest dude with writtens, walks in and, is asked to battle like true smack URL style battling with Mr. Fab, there's no chance. It's just a different skill set, right? It's like trying to get Shaq to win the 3-point contest. It's, yeah. he's a dope basketball player, but it's just not going to happen. So, okay, so cool. So
that happens. And, out of that, Joe doesn't appear. And as Royce tells it, Joe later disses Royce as kind of making, and I don't have the direct quote, but making the comment that Royce fell off at a DJ Envy's radio show at the time, which was not yet the Breakfast Club. So both of these MCs go on to diss each other on mixtapes. And if at that time, both of them had a propensity for conflict. My career started really professionally in 2002. One of the first people I ever interviewed was Royce. And that year, late 2002, early 2003, he and Proof were going at it. And I remember being in my dorm room in college with a landline, and I would call Royce, record the call Proof, get his response, that was one of some of my breakthrough work. So Royce, had a chip on his shoulder. Budden, we know he's had conflicts with the game, with Memphis Bleak, with 50, if I'm not mistaken. Younger, like Joe is Joe. And I think anybody knows that. So these two start going at each other on the first bar exam and Mood Music 3, respectively. And they kind of just get their little bars off. So Royce goes on to say, and now we're in 2008, he says, I guess Joe, he says, I guess he, meaning Joe, heard my disses and was like, oh, I guess this brother didn't fall off. The two were brought in to collaborate. And Royce says, so this brother calls me out of nowhere. I'm at the hospital. My first daughter's being born. We get the phone. He said, yo, man, I got this song I want you to get on. I started to be like, yo, what's up with that issue been talking? But I'm in the hospital about to have my first girl. Royce's manager at the time, Kino, was like, you shouldn't be dissing him, because I wrote some more stuff I was about to put out. So Royce backs off and pretends like nothing happened. And he says that's how Joe is too. Meanwhile, Royce says, I took the stuff personal. He didn't. I took it real personal. I was mad. He's totally oblivious. To him, it's just rap. I learned that about him once I got to know him. So Royce asked Joe who's going to be on the song. Joe says, I'm putting you, Crooked I, and Joell Ortiz. And Royce says, I'm like, man, that ish sounds like a Slaughterhouse. He goes, oh shit. I think I'm gonna call the song that. So Royce continues. So I left the hospital that night, went and laid the verse quick, came back to the hospital and sent it to him. He put it out the next day, and that's how Slaughterhouse was formed. Now, one thing I want to add to that, just for those playing at home, because it does matter with what transpired this month. That song featured another MC and somebody that I've known also for about 20 years, Nino Bless, who's a rapper out of Brooklyn, who, used to be, involved in the careers of Cool G Rap, was working with Joell in those early years. And Nino, who I've remained in touch with throughout that time, has gone on to become a great MC who releases a lot of his music off of DSP, but he was on the original Slaughterhouse song too, produced by Scram Jones.
Now, why do you think that he was not included in Slaughterhouse?
I'll never know that. And I don't know if Nino's ever spoken about that, but I would have to guess that if you have four well-established in the minds of rap consumers together, and then you have a fifth that is an emerging artist. Now, I know Nino, had been doing his damn thing for a while, but it's kind of a different situation. It's kind of like when G Unit reformed and they put, Kid in the group, who wasn't as established as Buck, Yayo Banks. And that's a lousy analogy, but I have to imagine something in there, unless it was a paperwork thing, sort of like you get with Cormega and the Firm. But for whatever reason, after that, Nino steps away. And at different points, I've heard Joe Budden and Crook and different people, they'll mention this part of the story because it's history. But I've heard, I think it was Joe goes, I don't want to get into it as far as Nino, but maybe out of this, we'll get a definitive answer on that.
So it's interesting because if I recall correctly, this is how Horseman started too. I think it was it a Cannabis track? There was one of them that had a track and they included the other members. And I think that the song was actually called Horseman. And they liked it so much, they said, you know what, we should just do this. We should do an album. We should become a group and do an album. So very, very interesting that this is how it happens. I wonder why there aren't more collectives that form, based on kind of like a classic track. Like imagine if Big Pun, Fat Joe, Jada, and Nas had come together and formed a supergroup after John Blaze. Like, I mean, can you imagine something like that?
You hear because what? It was Jay, Ja-Rule, and DMX, allegedly were toying with that Murder Incorporated, which again, named after the joint. So yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder. And again, I mean, to what we were saying at the top, Four Horsemen was a great example. There were Golden State Warriors with Exhibit, Saphir, and Razkaz. There was the Liquid Crew. There was Children of the Corn, Cash Money Click. There were all of these groups that we've often heard about, but didn't come to fruition. And Slaughterhouse is different because in a matter of months and really a year, they go from dissing to a song, and then what we're going to talk about in 2009, an actual album.
Right.
So out of all of that, you start to see a song turn into a group. And then, I mean, the way that, the music industry was moving at that time, before very long, you have an album. 2009 comes, and like we just said, I don't know why Nino Bless did not continue in the conversation, but for speculative reasons, the four more established artists step forth. They formed Slaughterhouse. They signed an independent deal with Koch Records, which soon became E1. And at that time, 50 Cent had made the joke in 2006 that Koch was a graveyard. He used that as an attack on Jim Jones and Dipset. And Koch was, New York-based label. They had put out early stuff by KRS-One, after he left Jive. But they were, I think, very artist friendly of hey, here's a budget, we'll market it, we'll see if radio takes, do what you do. And by that point, they started to find success with Fat Joe, with DJ Unk. I mean, I remember at the time, not Hurricane Chris, but it doesn't matter. But Slaughterhouse becomes this group that people are starting to get excited about. And in August of that year, they released the kind of album that I feel like fans had hoped for. The production, you go down the list. You had Alchemist, Mr. Porter, DJ Khalil from Self Scientific, Focus, who I don't know if he was part of Dre's camp yet, but this album comes out from four guys who are kind of at an impasse, and it reaches number 25 on the charts. And again, like at that time, I feel as though Slaughterhouse was the antithesis of So Far Gone, or the antithesis of Day and Night by Kid Cudi, or even Jay-Z making Empire State of Mind. Like this 2009 is a wild year in hip hop. There weren't a lot of, truly, truly great albums on a major level. And for this group to come and bar you over the head with this album is really interesting.
Well, I'm gonna push back on that a little bit. I'm gonna say there are plenty of great albums. There just weren't a ton of great albums that were quote unquote underground, like focused strictly on bars, no R&B hooks, no big, mainstream samples. Because, this is the era, and it's interesting because this is my entrance into the blogosphere. This is the era where hip hop is being dominated by Lil Wayne, Jeezy, Rick Ross, T.I., Drake is you mentioned So Far Gone. This is like his kind of debut year. And for me, hip hop was in a place where I wasn't checking for it anymore. I almost like abandoned ship and became one of those dudes who's just like only listening to stuff from the 90s. But two things changed my perspective. So one was a friend of mine hit me to Not Right. Because when I started going to Not Right, and Not Right, for those who don't know, is one of, in my mind, the best hip hop blogs ever created. Always incredible, simple presentation, very little fanfare about the song, but just posting and keeping people up to date on the dope underground, non-radio play hip hop of the day. And so, I started getting on that. I discovered this artist from Not Right, J. Cole, who had put out some mixtapes before, but dropped this mixtape called The Warm Up, which absolutely blew my mind and, made me think, wow, this guy is the savior of hip hop. He's like the LeBron to Jay's MJ. He is going to be the one who puts hip hop on his back and restores it to his glory. So at this time, I think that hip hop is in a place similar to what Ninth Wonder has described as like a divide, where, he says that the underground was kind of formed there was a day back in 1997, I believe it was, 96,
June, yeah.
June of 96, where De La Soul dropped Stakes is High, and Nas releases It Was Written. And Nas, who had represented what would kind of go on to become the underground, like gritty, lyrical, working with like non-Scrabble producers. People thought he was going to continue in that direction, but he goes left and does what Jay did later on and creates really commercial kind of mainstream records. Meanwhile, you have De La dropping an album that, is produced in part by Dilla, got Common, and like super lyrical, although also incredibly musical, but representing a different kind of aesthetic. And so 2009, in my opinion, is when we had the reemergence of the underground. We had seeds of it back in 2007 and 2008 when Blue and Exile released Below the Heavens, and in my mind kind of like recharged the underground a little bit. But I think that it really started to get back into what I think was a new golden age for underground around 2009. And to your point, a lot of that had to do with what the blogs were doing.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I think it was interesting, though, because it was becoming a time where, in the underground boom of the late 90s, early 2000s, you could go to the record store and buy it. You could get 12-inch singles. You could get, non-major distributed albums. The best music of 2009, in large part, is coming in Z shares, or on Dat Piff. Like, it's living in the cloud, and you're not going to go to Best Buy or your mom and pop record store and be able to find it. I honestly would argue that 2009 is one of the worst years for release music. I was at DX at the time, and I remember we really struggled to find album of the year. We ended up giving it to Raekwon with Only Built for Cuban Links 2, which is a great album, but you're giving the best honors to a sequel to an album that's 15 years old. I mean, that should tell you something right there. And I bring all that to say, Slaughterhouse represented freshness. You know, they're signed to a label that puts their CDs in Best Buy, in Sam Goody, wherever you're still going to get it. And there's four guys that you're familiar with if you're a hip hop fan, and they're not catering to radio. They're not chasing. They are just barring you to death and making something really interesting and fun. And that's what that first album was.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I get what you're saying. I would say that Drake and So Far Gone was an incredibly dope album. I'm going to call it an album. It was offered for free. It eventually did go on sale. But I thought that it was one of the best albums I'd heard in a long time. You know, and he had a bunch of different styles. He was lyrical, but he also had the R&B stuff, and he was purportedly unsigned. So I found that to be incredibly hopeful. Like I said, I thought the warm up, you know, was an incredible release. You know, I can't remember when. I think it wasn't Teflon. What was the album before Teflon?
Yeah, it was not Trilla. Trilla, right? The 2008 one, right?
Yeah, I can't remember. But you know, there was some, and I'm pulling it up now. So yeah. The Blueprint 3 was out, and I agree that wasn't a great album. UGK for Life I thought was dope.
I mean, it was good. You know, Fashawn in Exile, you just mentioned Blue. Brother Ali put out Us. DJ Quick and Corrupt had a dope album. It was there. It was just a different kind of year. And then you look at 2010, where you've got, you know, Crit, and you've got you know, the start of what became, and you look at 08 with Q-Tip, and I don't know. It's a tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger point I'm making is I view 2009 as hopeful, not necessarily because of the impact of any of the releases, but because of the groundwork and the seeds that were planted. And one of the biggest seeds was Slaughterhouse.
Yeah, word. So the album comes out. I mean, you know, at the time, the charts meant a whole lot more than what they do today. Going to number 25 says something. And if I'm not mistaken, I was living in Philly at the time. I believe Slaughterhouse went on the road. I mean, they were an independent act. They really made it fun. And in 2010, you know, the group starts to deal with Shady Records. You've got to think. I mean, Crooked I is a product of the Wake Up Show in part. So is Eminem. Royce and Eminem grew up together. They made the Bad Meets Evil joints in the late 90s. You know, there's a lot of history there. Joell has ties to Dr. Dre, you know, which is in the same, you know, umbrella, Interscope umbrella as Shady. You've got some familiarity there. And Joe Budden's Joe Budden, and, you know, had kind of done his thing. And in 2010, Shady Records really starts to make things exciting. You know, they put out a Bad Meets Evil album, get Royce his first gold plaque. Really kind of start to do, I think, what fans want Eminem to do. And it coincides with Eminem making Relapse and Recovery. You know, M, who had kind of spent the 2005 to 2009 a little bit out of the spotlight, it's one of those seasons of his life where he's making it exciting again. Slaughterhouse is fully independent. So, you know, they kind of start dancing together. Nothing's official. Slaughterhouse releases an EP as an addendum to the album. I think they work with Black Milk. They put out one of my favorite songs the group ever did called Move On. They did a version with a live band, and that to me is still probably my favorite Slaughterhouse song of all time. But in early 2011, they officially signed to Shady Records in January by my count. Do you remember getting that news?
I don't remember getting that news. Where was it? Oh, it was BT at that time. Oh, actually, you know what? I do remember that. I remember the photos of them with M. It was a really, really exciting time. And, you know, just to pause for a second, I think it's worthwhile in just talking about Eminem's ear, or at least the shady ability to recognize talent at a relatively early stage, or actually to kind of recognize it at that inflection point and come in at a time where they can potentially amplify it. So obviously the biggest is 50. 50 became one of the biggest superstars ever in hip hop, and it was that affiliation with Shady, which really took that to a whole different level. But on smaller scale, you had M seeing the potential in Griselda. And even though they didn't release an album that went like incredibly bonkers, it definitely supercharged that group, in my opinion. You saw what they did with Slaughterhouse. You have artists like Boogie, who you and I both like really love artistically, and then Yellow Wolf. That being said, with the exception of 50, I can't think of like a breakout album from Shady. Can you?
D12. I mean, the Purple Pills era D12, and that's a different one because that song was everywhere, and that group got the initial push, and then you have 50. I think I remember the Anger Management mixtape, and then you started to get Obi Trice. I mean, Obi had some bangers. Like, he started to come in. I think he put out 2 albums with Shady. But the thing of it is 50 just kind of boxed the space, not by his own doing, but what is Shady Records? And that's to me why Slaughterhouse is exciting, because throughout the 2000s, Shady as a unit gets kind of caught up in the Benzino and the Murder Inc. beefs. You're putting out gangster rap. D12, M's rocking with, and then he kind of steps away more and more. Then Proof dies. So at different 5-year periods, Shady keeps reinventing itself of what are we going to be? And in 2011, when M and Paul Rosenberg signed Slaughterhouse, it kind of feels like what you thought Shady might do pre 50 Cent. It's a different group. Like, D12 is wildly talented, no doubt about it. But I always feel that perhaps it was the Interscope aspect of it, but they always kind of marketed themselves silly. You had Bizarre being just that. You had, the group was druggy and silly. We didn't get a chance, at least in the mainstream facing aspect, to see their talent, in my opinion, as much as I think they possessed. With Slaughterhouse in 2011, it's like, oh, this is Eminem doing what he would have done if he would have launched Shady with the resources he has now in 1999 or 2000. And so
I agree with that. I think the thing to your point about the way the D12 was marketed is that also for newcomers to D12, your first experience with D12 is with Eminem, and you see it as Eminem's group. Right. You don't see them as a separate entity. You see them as a group of Eminem and his collective from Detroit coming together. And because M still had that Slim Shady persona, attached to him, I think that gravitational pull is what led to the more kind of silly presentation of D12. I think to some degree that affected Slaughterhouse as well, just like that, being around Eminem, once he's in a group or associated with a group, it becomes about him. It's like, Kendrick with TDE and, Jordan with the Bulls and whoever, no matter how talented the people are around him, it becomes more about him. So I think that might've been part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I just feel like that concept of a band of misfits felt really exciting. So later that year, 2011, they signed, and now you're dealing with a major. So you're not going to rush out an album. It's a different time than it is 10 years later today. But their one big moment was, and not for nothing, the group individually, continues to fan the flames at the blogs of putting out, different freestyles and series. They're very active, no question about it. But when TV time is a top commodity, Shady Records gets a BET Cypher, and that's the first one. And do you have any recollection of that? I know you said you were working there at the time.
Yeah, this was the Shady 2.0 Cypher with M, right?
And Yellow Wolf, yeah.
And Yellow Wolf. And first of all, the beat was incredible. It's just that simple, doom, doom, with that harpsichord to it.
It's Tried by 12 by Flatbush Project.
Yeah. That beat was absolutely incredible for them because it was simple enough to let their lyrics really do the heavy lifting. And I think one of the moments that people are always going to remember was Royce's "Hi Rihanna," shooting a shot at Rihanna on national TV. I wasn't at that one, unfortunately, because I think it was recorded in Detroit in a studio. But I remembered that as being one of my favorite ciphers ever, and I think it really put them on the map. Slaughterhouse, for a lot of people who were kind of casual listeners of hip hop and who weren't, into that super lyrical scene. But again, I think it also like became Eminem's cipher with his group rather than, as a collective.
Yeah, I mean, that's my recollection of it. I know that there's two, and we're going to talk about them later, and sometimes history blurs those two together for me. But when you say that Trial by 12 beat, yeah, that's easy to remember that one. So in 2012, things really heat up. By August, and throughout the year, the group is on the cover of The Source and Double XL. They're really starting to get treated with that, that push. And this is back when the marketing tactic, you mentioned Rick Ross. I think of the Albert Anastasia mixtape having all those joints on it, and that were eventually on the album. In August, they put out On the House. What a great title for a free mixtape. And then just a matter of weeks later, they put out the major label debut, Welcome to Our House. Executive produced by Eminem. It goes to number 2 on the charts. And this is a 2012 again, where charts were based on sales, so people are going to the stores and buying it. It's interesting too, the big hit on that album was My Life, which has CeeLo Green on it. And I played it this morning. I hadn't played it in a while. And it samples that, dance track, Rhythm of the Night by Corona. And they kind of interpolate it to My Life. And here's a quote about that came out later from Royce the 5'9". He says, "I know for a fact that I felt really good about My Life going into it. And the only reason I felt good about it is because I was judging it off of experience of something else with Bad Meets Evil, which he had put out the year before with Held the Sequel. So it's like a misfire. I just thought it was a logical next step. I felt it in my heart. So when it didn't connect, I felt good about it because I knew exactly why." And I think that quote is really emblematic of the album. There's absolutely moments on it that are, hip hop quotables, but it kind of has a very mainstream or pop aimed veneer to it. Yeah. Is that how you remember that album?
It is. I remember being extremely disappointed. It felt a lot like, again, I think this is no shade to Eminem. He is the artist he is, but he's been established as a pop artist, and this has been, present in his career throughout. We'll talk about the album that the Budden savaged in a minute, but I think that he's navigated between super top 40, top 10, like commercial type hip hop versus more underground stuff. His first album, before the Slim Shady LP, is it Infinite? That album sounds completely different. Sounds like a Duck Down record, which is the label he was going toward. And he's had moments like that. I think the Marshall Mathers LP is the one that really approximates that the most, and it's probably why it's my favorite M album. The pop stuff, I have respect for, but I never really loved. And this album became that. I remember really liking On the House, the mixtape. Mm-hmm. I think I remember the single was House Rules, and I thought I still bang that today, and so I was super excited for the album. But what I should have realized at the time was that was the play for the streets. And this was the play for the big, radio platinum success in the bag. And that just was anti who Slaughterhouse was. So I think it backfired.
Yeah. And earlier that year, I think you were in the building too. You were at the Shady Showcase at South by Southwest.
Yeah, I was. I remember that. Vaguely. It was a South by night. So
if I'm not mistaken, I was with John Master, who's worked with a lot of the people we're talking about. And I want to say I was sitting next to John in 38 Special, which, boom, fast forward 10 years, who knew? But that showcase was nuts. And if Action Bronson performed and Big Crit, and 50 is still the only time in my life I've seen Eminem perform. But Slaughterhouse came out, and no one knew what to expect with that album. And you're right, the mixtape was like, oh yeah, like this is gonna be everything that that first project was, with bigger budgets, better resources, better videos. And then it was kind of a surprise. And I played My Life this morning, and it's, if you didn't know who these guys were and took away preconceived expectations, you might be really happy with it. But it was a challenge. And I think a lot of what I just agree with what you said. I think in the 2010s, Eminem didn't necessarily have his pulse on the people the way that he has later and before. And so 2013 happens, and perfect segue. That's the year Eminem puts out Marshall Mathers 2, which is all encompassing. And the big thing for Slaughterhouse that year was their second BET Cypher, which might be, you were there for that one.
Yeah, I was there for that one. It was them, just the four of them. It's interesting about the ciphers because they often involve multiple takes. And so while you're there, it's cool seeing it unfold, and, you hear punchlines, and it's great to be, witnessing something that is happening from its inception, basically. But it's not until you go back into the edit room and cut it together that kind of what you have. I could tell, all these dudes are lyrical and they're dope. So, they all have bars, and it was great. But at the time, Kino is a really good friend of mine, Royce's manager over the years. And we had a friendly bet going in. I bet him that TDE Cypher was going to be better than Slaughterhouse's Cypher. Again, no shade to Slaughterhouse, but, TDE, where my guys was rocking really heavy with them at the time. And so I got to see the Slaughterhouse Cypher, and then I saw the TDE Cypher. And, again, man, like we had a corporate sponsorship that forced us to do like a scratch in between each verse. DJ Premier was a DJ who did these. But the TDE Cypher, if it could have been played the way that it actually was recorded, was even more incredible than what we saw on TV. Because again, this was Isaiah Rashad's debut. SZA was there in the background, and you had Black Hippie, so J-Rock, Ab-Soul, Kendrick, and Schoolboy Q. But the way they did it was there was no pause in between, and their verses, one's verse would end, and it was a perfect segue to the other person's verse. So there was like one line that Schoolboy had where he ended like something like rock, and then J-Rock, he goes, rock got it, and then like he goes into his verse. So it was incredible. And originally Kendrick wasn't going to rap. He was just going to be like, he was just going to MC and just host. And, we asked him to do a verse, and, he came back and did the verse that shook hip hop. It was basically Control Part 2. He'd done his verse on Big Sean's Control just a few weeks before that, where he basically name checked everyone in the industry and put them on notice that he was not only the king of LA, but also the king of New York. And in this verse, which was over Mobb Deep's Shook Ones, he went absolutely berserk. And so I won that bet with Kino. He was like, "Yo, you had inside information, man. You set me up." But no one knew Kendrick was going to black out the way he did. But both were great ciphers.
That's really that's dope. And did you? I mean, you're modest. Did you have any input on getting Slaughterhouse that second cipher, or does it just speak for itself when they were down?
I can't remember, man. I had a lot of input at that time on most of them, so I definitely would have provided feedback. I probably did because, I did because I wanted the TDE versus Slaughterhouse. That's the whole way I wanted to position the ciphers, because at the time they were both, I think, the most lyrical crews out there. And, it was 4 and 4. I just thought it was like the perfect matchup, and I really wanted to see that. I remember actually doing some stories on AFH to that effect before. So yeah, Yeah, I did have input because I wanted to see that, and I thought that was going to be the highlight of the night was TDE versus Cypher, who had the best TDE versus Slaughterhouse, who had the best cipher.
You know, when you speak about those ciphers, they raise one point that I think needs to be said about Slaughterhouse. You got four guys who have established themselves, but when they rap together, there's synergy. You know, it reminds me of those like 90s Yankees teams or maybe the Bulls teams where you would have some journeymen that came from other places, but in that moment, they could just feed off of each other's energy. And it's interesting, you know, one of the things that's come up this week, and we'll talk about it later, is, you know, how much time did these guys really spend together when they weren't on the road or in the studio? You could have fooled me if that was the case, because when you watch them rap, it was like watching, you know, jazz musicians of one would feed off the next and create. And that was true at South by Southwest, and that was damn sure true of those ciphers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's 2013, and it's funny you mentioned Black Hippie too, because one of the things that I read about in researching this is that Black Hippie was supposed to appear on one of the Slaughterhouse mixtapes. I assume it was House Rules. I have to go back and look, but it never happened, you know.
Right.
But
all right, so this is the House Rules. Yeah, I got them mixed up. I definitely like that Slaughterhouse mixtape before the album better, but House Rules was the one that like I just killed me. But yeah, you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. So 2014, you and I are rocking and rolling at AFH. House Rules mixtape comes out, 10 songs. Included in those 10 are four solo records. So you get the sense, maybe not at the time, but in retrospect, that, you know, they're puffing it up a little bit to get some stuff out. This was also the Shady XV year. So Slaughterhouse releases Psychopath Killer, which gets a video on that. And at this point, people are starting to talk about the third Slaughterhouse album, the second with Shady. Title's already being out there, you know, like a Detox, and it's going to be called Glass House. Dope title, keeping the theme going. You know, in an interview with Hip Hop DX, Just Blaze is confirmed to be the executive producer of the album. I think for a lot of people that, you know, may have been disappointed with the production of Welcome to Our House, Just Blaze is always one of those names that you're going to feel, you know, safe, like, yo, it's in good hands, especially knowing that Just has been, you know, I mean, he was all over Joe Budden's first album, you know, gave him a hit. They gave each other a hit, I should say. Interestingly enough, 2014 is also the year that Prime unveils Royce the 5'9's group with DJ Premier. This week, Mike Herron, who's VP of A&R at Shady Records, said that Prime began as a Slaughterhouse and Premier EP. Crooked Eye has since gone on Clubhouse and said, you know, that might be a little bit misleading. He said that he had heard about it, but it wasn't mapped out to that extent. Just an interesting piece of fodder that comes out of all of this, because you and I have both been, you know, huge Prime fans. We've worn the hoodies on this podcast. You know, did a whole piece with Premier and Royce on the album. Just interesting kind of what if moment. But what we're starting to see is that Slaughterhouse is moving a little bit away from the spotlight in terms of Shady Records. Anything you want to add for 2014?
Nah, man, it's just, this has become one of those mythical albums. You know, I won't say it's at the status of like a Detox, but you know, based on everything we've heard, and I know you're going to talk about this in a few minutes, this is the album that Slaughterhouse fans wanted. And the fact that it is still on a shelf somewhere is almost criminal. You know, I wonder if it, you know, and that was with Horseman too, right? It took almost 20 years for them to put out their actual album. You know, there was some bootleg stuff and some, you know, unauthorized stuff that came out before. So I guess that if anything, that there's hope, you know, that for that, you know, it's only been 6 years, maybe we'll get it by 2034, but, you know, it just sounds like this is the one that everyone wanted.
Yeah. And I think everyone is kind of asking these guys. I don't think, you know, it's funny. I mentioned that song Move On, which is a concept song about the things that all four men keep hearing in the interview. So they just kind of interview themselves. And, you know, all four of these guys are just daunted and haunted with Slaughterhouse questions. And when you start to hear things of Just Blaze being involved, it's only going to whet the fans' appetite more. And let's not forget, I mean, Prime is a prime example, pun intended. All four of these guys are continuing to making music solo, side collaborations, whatnot. But yeah, it's moving further and further from the light. So you get 2015. Just an interesting point of note in retrospect. AFH covered it. Joe Budden releases a song called Slaughter Mouse, which is a stand-like dedication to Eminem. And, you know, all four of these guys love concept records. You can speculate that he was just trying to, you know, nudge Marshall and be like, yo, I'm here. I respect you. And hope, I mean, look at the title of the track of like, yo, let's keep this process ongoing. And there's only one other point I want to add about that too. I mean, Shady Records is through Interscope, and we're still talking about, you know, I mean, this is at this point 7 years ago. It is very hard to put out a major label album in the mid 2000s with all of the A&Rs approving, with all of the clearances. It's just different. I feel like nowadays we've moved further and further away from this, where an artist can, you know, I've heard Alchemist and Currency can record a song on Monday and put it out Tuesday. You couldn't do that back then. And especially at Interscope. I mean, that is the label of Dr. Dre. That is the label of Death Row in the 90s, distributor, I should say. And Interscope is famously like Jimmy Iovine, something would get to his desk or his team and he would say, this isn't ready. And that's why you see so many things kind of caught in the pipeline. And it starts to seem like Slaughterhouse is one of them. 2016, you know, Joe Budden puts out a solo project, his last one, produced by Arab Music, Arab Music. Nothing else really happens. I mean, everyone's active on their own planes. But 2017 is the tipping point. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, so 2017 comes up. We've got, you know, Chopping Block from Royce's Bar Exam 4. And this is an interesting time because Joe has made his transition. You know, he's had his podcast for quite some time, but he now gets on Everyday Struggle, a show on Complex that also features Nadeska and DJ Academics. Really, you know, unexpected pairing, but worked. And, you know, at this time, full disclosure, I'm working extensively with Joe. You know, I'm working on a project with him, you know, pitching to various TV networks. Won't talk about what that project was, but we worked together for a couple of years on it. I still think it's an incredible, incredible concept. You know, so I'm working very closely with him and see Everyday Struggle, which is, you know, effectively a first take for hip hop. And this show becomes, I would say, the biggest show in hip hop of the year. Like, it's doing insane numbers, over 500,000 views per episode on YouTube. Many of them surpass 1 million or more within a day, which is absolutely unheard of. It is like the biggest franchise that Complex has ever launched. And like all parties involved skyrocketed after this. We've seen what Academics has done with Twitch and, you know, how it's propelled him, and it supercharged the Joe Budden podcast too. You know, but there's a moment on it where they talk about Eminem's album, his new album. Which one is this?
It's called Revival, and
Revival.
It happens late in the year. And if I can jump in here one second, I mean, Joe Budden is so gifted at creating a moment. Like, you know, he is. You know, we talk about Tekashi 6ix9ine or we talk about 50 Cent. Joe Budden is very, very gifted, almost at creating memes. You know, so in 2016, I mentioned his album, but that is the year that Joe Budden, you know, is beefing with Drake. They're going back and forth. And with every one of those, not only are you getting songs, people are tuning into the podcast with Parks, Rory, and Mal to hear what Joe's going to say, how he's going to react. Like, it is, he's funneling an audience into his platforms. Then you have, and if I'm not mistaken, it's 2017, this moment on the red carpet with Migos, where there's confrontation and Joe throws his mic and walks away. Like, it becomes the gif of the moment. Like, Joe creates this just excitement, and he plays really well. I mean, there's no surprise. This guy's been on Love and Hip Hop and created moments there. Earl Sweatshirt doing the, like, it's Joe. So boom, fast forward, you get to December, and at this point, you know, Eminem is rolling out Revival, which began with the BET Cypher, the last Shady Cypher, which, while Royce is sitting on one of the Cadillacs, well, Benny and Conway rap. I don't think Gun rapped. I think Gun kind of played host, if I'm not mistaken. And Boogie was there. Slaughterhouse is nowhere to be found. You know, Slaughterhouse has moved on, pun intended. So I'll hand it back to you. Everyday Struggle. Em is 2 singles deep at this point. Walk on Water and Untouchable.
Yeah. So Joe, is doing, Everyday Struggle. He's created moments. In my opinion, I think that the thing that kind of launched him to before Everyday Struggle, at least the thing that put him on my radar and said this guy would make an incredible host, was he had a moment at Hot 97 where he was asked up for an interview. There was a woman who used to be on the podcast before Roy
Marissa Mendez.
Yeah. Marissa Mendez, who was now on Hot 97. And Joe walks in for what he thinks is going to be an interview about a project. And instead, he is grilled for like 45 minutes by Peter Rosenberg and Ebro, with Marissa kind of looking on and chiming in periodically about why Marissa was kind of taken out the podcast. And Joe, this is a masterful interview. It's on AFH, but you go back and look at it. He is like Neo in the Matrix, where he is just, dodging bullets, and then, eventually just controls the bullets and make them drop, and it's like 3 against 1. And in my opinion, he's the one who comes out the victor in this intellectual debate, but it shows you the power that he has as a personality and his way with words. So Eminem's album is not out yet, but the 2 singles, Walk on Water and Untouchable, have been released. And Joe goes on Everyday Struggle and absolutely savages the singles. He says, "Throw it in rice. This is one of the worst songs I've ever heard. This is the first time in my life that I feel like the ball is being dropped by Eminem." And then he says, "Eminem, and you will not use the plight of Black people to sell an effing record and widen your profit margin. Em, I love and respect you. The things I learned from him is part of the reason I retired early, because if you're at the top of rap, I don't want that," suggesting that you don't want to go until you start to be in decline. Em is surrounded by too many musical geniuses to put this quality of music out. Whew. So, I mean, those words, he does not mince words at all. And it's interesting, because we just wrote an article a couple of weeks ago about Eminem, taking a knee at the Super Bowl. Em, has been an activist for years, for many things, for political causes, for Black Lives Matter, against Trump. There are a lot of things that Eminem has taken a stand on. So, in a lot of ways to suggest that he is doing something to broaden his platform because, using the plight of Black people, that doesn't really fit the narrative of who Eminem has been over the last, 20 years or so. And so there's a lot that feels personal about this. Part of it is that it's just 2 singles, and you and I have talked quite a bit about the fact that, Eminem, does the pop records, but then he'll have some album cuts that are for the streets and things like that. And so it's very difficult to say what the album is going to be like without hearing the entire body of work. Also, this is, Joe has been doing this podcasting, but at this point, I think he's very much still seen as a rapper who's doing a podcast, not as a person who's doing a podcast who used to rap. And right. So him coming out and being so, explicitly critical of a body of work is also jarring, and especially when that's of the person who put him on, with Slaughterhouse as part of the group. So, one of the things you talked about was Joe being able to create moments. And, one of our colleagues, Justin Hunt, has an entire video clip called Fire in the Stadium. His notion is that there are times when, there are things that propel something to a different level. And so a great example of that is the Ray J moment with the Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club had been on for some time, but it wasn't until Ray J went absolutely berserk and called in and was going against Fabulous and, saying, he's things I won't even repeat, but he was saying things that that were off the wall that really put the Breakfast Club on the map. And that's a fire in the stadium moment. So Budden had a couple prior to this for Everyday Struggle. So the first one that I recall was he and Lil Yachty got into a pretty heated debate, and it turned into like almost a generational war. And Yachty held his own, I thought, but that became a really viral moment. You know, I guess another term for fire in the stadium is a viral moment. And then the second is the one that you alluded to with, Everyday Struggle has set up on the red carpet of the BET Awards. I was there that year. I think it's the same year that Nipsey Hussle also slapped. Do you remember who it was that Nipsey slapped in the parking lot that year? I can't remember, but it was an eventful year. And so one of the things that happened is that on Everyday Struggle live at the BET Awards, they're interviewing Migos on the red carpet. And, they and Budden and Migos get into it, and it ends up in a standoff. And, Budden drops the mic and just walks off, and like it went crazy. And so that was another moment. But I think it was this Eminem moment, because those moments were big, right? Yachty and Migos both got extensive coverage for days. But this Eminem thing, I think, put Everyday Struggle over the top and made it like the biggest thing in hip hop for the rest of its time with Budden. And he talked about it also on his podcast. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Joe had this ability of saving some for later, and we'll talk about that more. And you're absolutely right, though. Joe's done it different times in his career, but this was the Everyday Struggle moment. So this happens 10 days before Christmas. It's covered, but there's not immediate response. And then, so now we move into 2018, and Eminem releases a Chorus Septic remix with 2 Chainz. And it's very clear. I mean, I remember where I was when you and I were texting about how AFH would cover this. The lyrics reference criticism. M raps, not as raw as I was. Walk on Water sucks. Then he goes, B, suck my D. Not in those words. Y'all saw the track list and had a fit before you heard it. You formed your own verdict while you sat with your arms crossed, did your little reaction videos, and talked over songs. What's interesting about that is, in retrospect, we know exactly who he's talking about. That's not an Ebro. That's not a Charlemagne. That's a Joe. Especially
it's a Joe and Academics. It's a Joe word. Yeah. Yep.
And Joe right away says it's not about me. Bizarre from D12. Here we are back to D12.
I thought that was bizarre, by the way. That was the one thing I was like, I thought that was disingenuous. There was no question that song was about Joe, in part and probably mostly, but it shows also how Joe is able to deflect on things. There are times when, he just won't, not only will he not take the bait, he'll try and reshape the narrative. And I think this is one of those instances, and that's going to come up in this call that we're going to recap in a few minutes too. But just keep that in mind. I'm going to plant that seed.
Most definitely. And then Joe and Bizarre get into it, where Joe, basically alleges that Bizarre hasn't been around Eminem in years. Why are you his spokesperson? And I'm just looking here, and then it's super duper escalates. Joe, in the closing minutes of the clip, Joe Budden states that he is waiting for a beat. So Joe says on his podcast that there's somebody that can bring him out of retirement, but it's not going to be Bizarre. This is direct quote. He goes to an unnamed MC, he goes, him, I'll come out for a pause. And then he adds, I didn't get dissed by Eminem. So again,
let's put a pause there too, because this is going to come up also. Okay. And we glossed over the fact that Joe is now retired. So part of him transitioning to a podcast personality and getting Everyday Struggle, he says that he is not going to rap anymore. And, we've heard this a million times from rappers. Like, there's so many rappers now at this point who've retired and unretired that is not even a news story. And so I don't think that a lot of people are taking him seriously at this point because it's fresh. But he has said, at that point, and he says this consistently, he says it almost every single day on Everyday Struggle, which was a 5-day-a-week show, that he is retired. And there are a lot of people who come at him, many because of things that he's said on the show or appearances they've had where he's rubbed them the wrong way. And, anti Johnny Gill, I guess. And, he, and so he seems to be really serious about this. He is not coming out, but he says if one person, never reveals who it is, who might get him to come out of retirement.
So that transpires, and Royce even alleged more recently. So for the next few months, the members of Slaughterhouse are kind of caught in the crosswinds of what is the relationship. In March, Royce tells Rap Radar, I thought if anybody would understand how important it is to walk around eggshells with each other's art, if anybody, I thought Joe Budden of anybody would understand. It's just what we do. The thing that he said I really didn't like was something along the lines about them using the plight of Black people to sell a record. That's a little crazy to me because he knows Marshall personally and he's been in the studio with him. That speaks to your point of, M's activism throughout the years. So, Royce has kind of, distanced himself from the situation, speaks in it, and that's only obviously a pull quote, but says that he can understand why Eminem would feel such a way about this, and that Joe Budden should understand better. Then, so that's March. In April, I remember texting you, I think I was in Baltimore, Maryland. All of a sudden, Crooked I releases a statement. I'm no longer part of Slaughterhouse. I'm no longer part of that collective. It ain't no beef. It's all love. I wish them dudes nothing but success. I mean that. Ain't no problems with Shady Records. I love Shady. What they do for me and what they continue to do for me, I'm very appreciative. I've been sober for 2 years. Let me tell you a secret. Sober Crook likes to rap. Slaughterhouse ain't rapping together no more, and that's fine. It was fun while it lasted. And again, Crook makes it a point to mention Glass House and tells fans that it exists, but he has no clue of the status. If it comes out, I'll retweet it. Other than that, it's all love. Everybody who supported me in Slaughterhouse, thank you. So, in my opinion, this is Crooked I kind of jiggling the handle of, we've said for the last 2 to 3 years, Slaughterhouse has moved further and further away from the spotlight as it pertains to Shady Records. Joe Budden continues to get himself more and more established. Royce is finding more and more acclaim on the solo tip. He's put out Layers at this point, Prime One. Joell is active, and Crook is going. And let's not forget, Crook has put out projects. I use the word projects, but much like a J Electronica, Crooked I has never come out and said, this is my solo album. He's kind of kept it in the tuck for all of these years. So of the 4 guys, Crook is a little bit limited. He's got COB, Circle of Bosses. He's got, his brother raps. He does different ventures, but a non-active Slaughterhouse is going to affect Crooked I's activity just in rap. But anything you want to add?
No, I think that captures it. Everybody's established at this point. Prime One was a big hit for folks, and that's the collaboration between Royce and DJ Premier. I think that album was absolutely incredible. Royce is like in peak form. I think it's a rebirth for him lyrically and musically. You and I have talked often about how he's a better rapper in his 40s than he's ever been in his life. And I think this is the beginning of that time period for him. Joell is just consistent. He's, never, no peaks and valleys, just kind of consistent the whole way through. So everybody's doing their thing at this point.
And it becomes a talking point. And Royce alluded to this week. 2018 is the year that he puts out Prime 2 and Book of Ryan, which up until that point, I think is Royce's best work, period, dot, exclamation point. I could argue that Allegory is better, but up until that point. So there's a video of DJ Premier and Royce on allhiphop.com. You got Premier, one of the heroes of hip hop, and you got Royce. And obviously a question comes up of Slaughterhouse. So Royce addresses it, and this is fresh off of Crook's, stepping away from the group, and he gives context. So Royce says, when we got in there and started talking about doing the 3rd album, The second on Shady, we got in there with producers, Justice League, Ill Mind, A-Rap Music, Just Blaze, and we started working. And we did a body of work. We still felt like we needed more. But then after that, Joe was doing Love and Hip Hop. Joell started doing some other shit. Crooked started doing some other shit. And me and DJ Premier did Prime. Since then, we haven't been able to catch each other at a time we all wanted to give 100% at the same time. I just look at Slaughterhouse as something that we knew had a time limit to it. We knew it because we were all solo artists before. I feel like we stretched it longer than any other group that has ever tried to do what we do. So Royce, and we, that is a direct quote out of an AFH story. Royce is kind of just saying, give Slaughterhouse its flowers. I'm trying to think of other groups in hip hop that are like that. I mean, there's several examples. Ghetto Boys comes to mind. NWA of like, yo, this ran its course. We're doing other things. Leave it at that. But
yeah, and the interesting thing for me about this is, okay, so it's one thing for them to all be busy and just not come back together and do a project. It's another thing for now 2 of the 4 members, so Crooked and Royce, to affirmatively say that we are not doing any more music together. That to me is like that's a bigger statement. Like they could have just remained silent and just like kind of like Mohsen and Talib, and just let people speculate and stuff like that. But they are affirmatively shutting down the notion of Slaughterhouse. Why do you think that was? By you think there's beef at this point? Is there bad blood that's flowing?
I think Crook's explanation is self-explanatory. I think that for Royce, and you got to give context to the moment, a lot of people liked Prime 2 a real lot, and Book of Ryan was excellent. And Royce is basically saying, move on. Like, I'm going to give you this statement so that we don't have to talk about this the next time I'm up in here. Slaughterhouse has run its course. And if you look at it, Royce has the most incentive to say it. And meanwhile, I feel like Crooked's comment in his statement in April was to challenge the group. Like, hey, I'm going to push myself into the narrative. If you don't want to rap anymore, then I'm stepping away. And I think, from what I've deducted of Crooked Eye, what he hopes comes out of that, quite obviously, is that the group goes, no, wait, let's take it into our own arms. Maybe Eminem says, let's release the album. Joe Budden says, wait, I'm going to block off these weeks. None of that happens. So the narrative just kind of drifts, until, well, go ahead.
I think there's some stuff going on behind the scenes, and we'll get into it, during this call. But, I think that because, again, there's no need to say we're not going to do anything else again. You can just let it stay, but we'll get into it.
So boom, August day, I remember I was on the road, and all of a sudden, with no warning, Eminem releases Kamikaze. And this album, whereas Revival was very much a political album aimed at the Trump administration, Kamikaze is Eminem, coming back at it and confronting all of his haters and doubters.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just got to ask a question, though. So looking back in hindsight, do you think taking the charge out of it, right, the bass out of it, do you think Budden's critique of Revival as a body of work was fair or not?
I think it was valid. It's funny. One of the things that's come, and you and I spoke about it, Kool Moe Dee in 1987 and again in like 98 does a rap report card. And there's artists on there, including Too Short, including Mace, that Kool Moe Dee clearly was not feeling. And he grades them. I think he gave them, C's and maybe some D's. But there's a level of care and objectivism there. And, in that comment in late 2017, Eminem goes out of his way to say, yo, Em, I love and respect you. Joe Budden does. But he really went for the soundbite. When you tell somebody to throw it in rice, you're getting a joke. That's a laugh line. And, we're going to talk about laugh lines this week with the call. But I think it got very, very, very subjective. I think Revival, I'm not going to say is M's worst album, because I actually am not the biggest fan of Relapse and Recovery. But, Joe didn't toe the line of, it was a good album. I mean, he went there, and a lot of critics echoed that. And I think Joe scored points as a commentator of the culture for saying the thing that was not diplomatic.
Yeah, I think for me, it is the Eminem album that I like the least. Relapse, probably second. Recovery, that was the 2010 album, right? With I'm Not Afraid.
Yeah.
I like that album a lot. I like that album a lot. A lot of people do. Yeah. That's one of my favorite M albums. This one just did not do much for me. It had the Skylar Grey, vocals, and was just very, very commercial. And I've just not been a fan of the commercial Eminem records, and was hoping for something different. But I do agree that, you can say what I just said and not say it with such vitriol and venom and disrespect. And so I think that the critique crossed a line. And then when you couple that with the fact that they have a personal relationship, I think it sends it through the stratosphere.
Yeah. I mean, you and I have been tasked with telling sensitive artists, some of the stuff that we don't feel, or the songs that you like more than others. That's part of the job. And Joe, at this point is referring to himself as media man. He's got, on top of this, he's got State of the Culture. He's doing a lot of things. But yeah, so M comes out of the blue with Kamikaze. Dissing is a focal point of the album, along with shots at Lord Jamar from Brand Nubian, MGK, Tyler the Creator. M goes at Budden, and he really goes at him on a song called "Fail" in a video verse, and he gets personal too. He brings up the fact that Joe has had allegations of domestic abuse before. Accuses him of falling off, all of that, and this is where it gets really interesting. But is there anything you want to say about Kamikaze before we get to Joe's response?
Well, so I guess Kamikaze, and I had this feeling back when it came out too, is the Eminem album that I wanted. This is M, aggressive. There's no pop stuff on it. Even though he's dissing, you can tell he's having fun just rapping. And I thought it was great, musically great, and competitive, hip hop spirit great. He's just going at everybody. It was like almost Kendrick on Control for an entire album. So I thought it was dope, and I think it actually helped to kind of burnish and restart his career quite a bit.
I would agree with that. He did a rollout afterwards. You remember that, where there were like 3 or 4 different nights where he sat down with Sway. That I thought pulled away from the music and made it more about the impact. But I agree with you. It's the album that I wanted Revival to be. It's the album that I want a late 2000 teens Eminem to sound like. So this is where Joe really kind of has built up his turbo, and he goes in on his podcast, and this became huge. And, the big pull quote is that Joe Budden alleges that he has been better at rapping than Eminem for at least a decade. He also, and this is episode 177 of the Joe Budden podcast, he also unpacks the context that we haven't gotten, and says that, he was super frustrated that while Slaughterhouse was at work on the third album, the second was Shady, there were no advances. You are not paying me for my work. And you have legal experience. That might not be how things work, but artists were making this happen. They were flying different places. And Joe, for lack of a better, wants his taste. And he also wanted creative input going to the group, because he felt as though Welcome to Our House was misguided by Eminem's production. And here's a quote that I'll say. This is out of the story. Joe says that Slaughterhouse would submit the project to Shady. Shady would make revisions, send it back. And Joe's verses were often pulled from the songs, including songs that he personally conceptualized. And Joe, in this episode, and this is interesting, he says that he is the most popular person in the group. So Joe has kind of set himself up differently.
Yeah, Joe set himself up as being the number one. And we just got a cameo from Theo, who often appears but rarely speaks. But he's got something to say about Budden and Slaughterhouse, so let that man speak. Anyway, and you're going to talk about his beats too, right? About how Em pulled the beats, and so I'll talk about this. One of the things that Joe said, this is a quote: "We had to send the album somewhere. By the time it came back, it was different." And he says that Eminem picked the beats. Every time we had to go and do more songs for the album, there'd always be 5 or 6 Eminem beats. They were horrible effing beats. And, Joe says the sounds were not ideal for Slaughterhouse. So, we've seen this. This has happened with the first album, where I guess there's a takeover and the sound that they're supposed to have isn't the one that they get. And so he says that, upon getting revisions, his versions were often pulled from the song. And he says that he wanted respect above money or fame. And on the point you were making about the advances, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, it's, you get an advance, but that is truly an advance. It's not a bonus. It's not money in your pocket. It's an advance against costs that you have, and that's everything in the recording process. So producers, music videos, marketing, everything is attached to that. And so it's very possible that even if the label makes money, you as the artist, because you're paying that advance back through the royalties that you get, which is a percentage of the sales, and it's often 12 to 14%. So even if the label recoups 85% of their work, you don't start getting money until it's 100%. And so, it's very possible that they weren't getting paid because they technically still owed the label money. So, Joe says that he wanted respect above the money and fame, and he thinks that he was the most popular member of the group.
And then he makes it about Slaughterhouse, which is interesting. And he is speaking to Eminem through his podcast. He says, "Newsflash, Em, I heard the album. Because I don't really think you know all the members that were in Slaughterhouse. I don't really think you know our history. Let me tell you what Joe Budden has thought this entire time. I've been better than you this entire effing decade." He adds, "But in my rapper brain, I'm a content brother, and you got to say something when rapping. You have not said anything for the better part of a whole effing decade. You have rhymed a bunch of words. Eminem is the best rhymer of words in the world, on the planet. He can rhyme letters. He can rhyme words that don't rhyme. He can rhyme accents damn near. He can do a lot. Boy, he's talented. Know the hip hop I fell in love with, the hip hop that said you got to say something. I personally haven't heard that Marshall in quite some time. How could I be mesmerized by somebody I think I'm better than? You've been in your own cocoon, so you're unaware of a few things. You don't know ish about ish, Em. And then he says, 3 brothers on your label that's better than you." I mean, that is heavy duty hands. And then he says one more thing. He says, "In the event that you want to undress me, brother, do it outside of your album rollout. Let me know that you mean it. Let me know that you got some time out of your day to go in the booth and address another brother when there was no financial gain involved for you. I keep saying that. And the second you do it, I'm on your ass. Hear me loud and clear. I am going to cut your effing ass up. And I've been waiting, baby."
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's worth that other quote too, right? Because I don't think you really know all the members that were in Slaughterhouse. I really don't think you know our history. Let me tell you what Joe Budden has thought this entire time. So yeah, you said that, but like, I mean, it's crazy that he goes that heavy on Eminem. Do you think it's true? First of all, do you think? I'll tell you what I think. I think at that time, all of the members are doing better work than Em is doing. I think
Agreed.
that Emmett hit a lull, and I think that actually Budden's critique woke him up and put a chip back on his shoulder. I want to speculate that he was going through the motions, but I think that Joe lit a fire under him. And, whether he wants to thank him or not, I think it led to some of his best output in quite some time. And I do think that Royce was doing phenomenal work at that time. It's ironic that Budden would say that because he had not put out work for some time, but I do believe that in summer of 2016, I think it was, when he and Drake got into it, that sparked Budden to some of his best work when he went 4 disc records unanswered. Like, I think his pen was as sharp as it ever been. We have several, projects we had covered from Crook and Joell at that time too. So these are guys who are putting in incredible work at a time where Eminem's career is kind of at a low.
So, I mean, Joe declares war, and he basically says it's one of the smartest tactics of, like, if that's what you think is going to get me off of my rock, no. So it dismisses this huge effort that Eminem's put into Kamikaze. It gives Joe the last word, and I don't think I've ever seen Eminem challenged like that. When Benzino and Ja Rule and other people had beef, it was usually on the personal side. It was usually on, smear tactics. And Joe's just making it about rap, which again is kind of back to the essence of Slaughterhouse. But it makes it very, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, but I guess I'll pull back and I'll say, regardless of who's right or who's wrong or whether both have merit, the reality is you have 2 men who are fundamentally important to a collective. One happens to be the label owner and the person who signed the group and put them on. Another's a member. The label owner happens to be like really close friends with Royce, another member of the group. So now the dynamics, the politics of what's going on have to be absolutely bonkers for everyone involved, but particularly for Royce, who's now caught in the middle of it, and and Joell and Crook, and Royce and Crook are very close too. So there's just got to be tremendous strain across the board on this.
And I mean, Joe has, especially collectively through his different outlets, he's got the biggest media platform in hip hop, and it's kind of even going beyond hip hop and just into a certain youth or just rap adjacent culture. Joe's microphone, millions of people are tuning in every week on TV, on podcasts. So you're gonna be in people's ear differently than an artist that puts an album or 2 out every year. And this is where
he's got the podcast, and at this point, he's also got the Revolt Show, State of the Union,
State of the Culture.
State of the Culture. Yeah, so he's double timing now. He's really, really hot and in his bag.
And then he expands to create another thing, an interview series called Pull Up, which, AFH has covered conversations with Jadakiss, Freddie Gibbs, 2 Chainz, on and on. And Joe's rollout, it was sponsored by Cash App, always included a trailer. So in that same year, that same summer, we get a trailer for Crooked I, Kxng Crooked, and Joe Budden on a Pull Up. The trailer is very terse. I mean, these 2 guys, are sitting down and venting about the state of Slaughterhouse. We never get the full episode. And it's been alluded to. And if you watch the trailer, which exists online, not on the channel, Kxng Crooked vents that he's upset that Joe did not support the group on social media. And he says there's internal emails at Shady Records that Joe didn't push Slaughterhouse. And I don't know if this applies to the first album on Shady. Knowing the way social media works, was probably mixtape stuff or the stuff on Shady XV or even Eminem stuff. And it's interesting because you're going to hear that same sentiment coming out of Joell more recently. Crooked I also tells Joe that he's disappointed for not responding to these brothers shooting at you on wax. Crook then alludes to a rapper that Joe has mentioned on his podcast that he would come out of retirement for, and asks if it's himself. Like, am I the guy that if I dish you, you'll come out of retirement? And Joe says, no. This is what he says. First of all, I wouldn't come out of retirement for an MC as capable of you. I'd go practice, then I'd come for your ass. Pause. And Crooked I says, put it on pay-per-view. Later about that episode, we'll never know why it didn't air, but Crooked I and other places has said, I think that Joe figured out, you know what, it's not going to be good to air, because a lot of dirty laundry came out. He told that to Talib Kweli on the People's Party podcast in 2019. So it's interesting. You got Crook and Joe sitting down. Then, you have that same year, you mentioned Joell staying his path. I think in 2018, Joell put out what I would contend is his best solo album. It's produced by Apollo Brown. It's called Mona Lisa. And on it, there was a song called Timberland Up. And for the remix, he got Joell, got Royce, and Kxng Crooked. No Joe Budden, but it keeps the Slaughterhouse narrative going. Also on that album, and you and I talked to Joell and Apollo about it at the time, Joell uses that album to kind of address being caught in the crossfire of Slaughterhouse. Not in a blame game, but he just says, like, look, we had this great thing and now it's not here anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we interviewed Joell and Apollo together, and that video's on our channel too if you want to check that out. And I agree with you that this is definitely one of Joell's best bodies of work. Shout out to Joell. We just interviewed him for his last album, The Autograph, a couple months ago. So continues to put out great work. This one on Mellow Music Group. But yeah, I mean, Joell, by all accounts, is probably the least one in the crossfires because of, he doesn't have the same relationship with Budden that Royce does at this time. And I don't know what his relationship is with Eminem, but it's certainly not that of Royce. But not that it's a competition, but the fact that he's also experiencing this and the heat just lets you know how big it is. And I'm very curious about that Crooked record. It's interesting too that he points out that Joe didn't come out for this, but I think in some ways come out of retirement, that might bolster the argument that Joe really is retired. He really is, for the moment, not saying permanently so, but there's nothing that's going to pull him out. And I think that's going to come into play in this conversation we're going to talk about in a couple minutes.
Yeah. And I mean, for Joe, it's been over 5 years. And, you can think of Too Short or Scarface or Jay-Z or Lupe or The Game, your boy Logic, all of these kind of pump fake retirements. No one's ever gone 5 years, without of that magnitude. So 2019, we leave 2018 with the tension of that Pull Up never airing. In 2019, right in this month, March, it gets interesting. Kxng Crooked sits in on Drink Champs. And of course, as Drink Champs does, they talk about it. And, he elaborates. He says, I feel like Joe Budden's approach was wrong. If you don't like something, say it's not for me. Or, yo, I don't like it. Or Eminem's the homie, but this ain't for me. When you say something is trash, you ish on Paul Rosenberg's rollout. You're taking it a little bit further. Crook continues. And then I know the backstory. I know that there were some issues that Joe Budden felt against the label. You're not giving Eminem a fair critique now because you've got malice behind what you're saying. It's personal. My whole thing was just keep it a buck. He goes on to say, I felt like Joe forgot about the helping hand when he was saying what he was saying. I don't forget solid itch. That's just not how I'm cut. And Crook goes on, and let's not forget, this was 5 months before Crook steps away from Slaughterhouse when Joe made the initial point. He said it definitely affected Slaughterhouse because me and Royce was working behind the scenes trying to get the Glass House album out to the people. The untouchable critique was like a grenade. He took the pin out and tossed the B. And then also he provides some context of Eminem. So one of the reasons why the group had more control over Glass House was because M owned that Welcome to the R House was not what the group wanted. He said, and this is Crook paraphrasing, I'm just going to let y'all rock. Whatever you want to do, handle it the way y'all want to handle it. Roll it out how y'all want to roll it out. Just do you. Crook says, we all agreed and went back into the lab. And then he continues, that's my problem with what happened. If you agree to go back and record another album and give it another shot, why is we still talking about Welcome to Our House? Meaning the album never came out. And it's just a frustrating thing. He also says that he and Royce were very hands-on with Slaughterhouse from the beginning to the end. He says they went to the trenches for it.
And he relocated too. Crook actually moved back to New York for 6 weeks at the time too. So he was fully committed to the project.
Yeah, which if Joe's saying no advance was released, you got to presume that Crook's coming out of his own pocket just to do that. And that's expensive. And I presume he's got a family and kids, and you make those sacrifices. And that episode's wild too, because, and I remember texting you about this, Rory from the Joe Budden podcast, who now is part of Rory and Mal and what they're doing, also happened to be there. And there's a very tense few moments where Crook, I think he shows the frustration that Joe Budden had caused his legacy his pockets, his career. And, Rory does a really objective job kind of speaking on Joe's behalf. Even though he says, I don't want to, I'm not here to be his spokesman, but it's a wild, wild thing. And I remember tuning in eagerly to the next episode of the Joe's podcast to see if it was addressed. And they collectively decided they were not going to do that. And that's an important element too of Joe has, especially at that time, this huge platform. So how are the comings and goings of the group that is currently on hiatus going to hit the podcast and get some serious promo? And that doesn't happen with that episode.
Yeah. So, Crook goes on and says, see, me and Royce were very hands-on with Slaughterhouse from the beginning to end. We really went in the trenches for Slaughterhouse. You get me? So when you go in the trenches like that, if you got a communication line with your brothers, then you talk to your brothers. This is what I'm about to do. Is this going to harm anything that you guys are doing? Try and get Glass House out right now, because I don't like my time to be wasted. If I'm flying from Cali to New York, sitting in offices, fighting for this Glass House-ish on my time, let me know if you're going to throw a grenade at somebody. Just let me know, and I won't get on that plane. You feel me? So, Crook is like, not mincing words. He, was very frustrated. And I don't think, again, going back to that tweet, just based on all this history, I don't see how there can't be, feelings about it. I don't, whether you want to define it as beef or not, there's definitely swirl going on that has negatively impacted these guys and caused them actively not to want to work together anymore. So it's beyond just we're taking a hiatus. To me, there's stuff that's gone on that's put us in a place where we actively do not want to work together anymore.
Exactly. And the next month in April, Crook goes, he's doing his kind of promo run, and he goes on No Jumper, another top podcast, and he tells Adam 22 that he and Joe Budden don't really speak. He said, I've tried to reach out to him a few times. The last time we spoke was when we did a pull-up episode. And as I just said, that didn't run. The ball's advancing a little bit. Later that year, on another episode of Pull Up, Joe Budden, just by happenstance, tells Freddie Gibbs that he's encouraging Slaughterhouse to replace his spot in the group. And this is the quote, just to keep it a bean. He says, that's why I ain't doing it. I can't speak why for they're not doing it. When I suggested they find probably another rapper to take my place and still put out music, they didn't think that was the greatest idea. And that was years ago. That might have changed. But my fight with that, even without the extra Eminem BS, is just ownership. I cannot devote this much time of my time to a project and eat a fourth from that project, and then have to go up the chain of command and have all these brothers making sure our project does what it's got to do, and then we're getting the scraps from the bottom. That was my fight.
That's 2019. 2019, Budden is talking about ownership and economics and how important that is, and his decision on whether or not to participate in the project. Let's plant that seed, because that again is going to come up in this conversation.
Yep. And at that same time, Lupe Fiasco, who's kind of a relevant adjacent figure to all of this, says, I'll be in Slaughterhouse, nothing comes of that. And at the time, as we know, Lupe and Royce go on to form a podcast in the days, weeks, and months that follow through the pandemic. Everyone's kind of doing their media tour. Crook goes on to tell Talib Kweli that, he took it really personally what Joe did. He says he reminds people, I have 3 Slaughterhouse tattoos. The way it was crumbling internally, I just didn't like it. And Crook says that, he worked as a go-between to Eminem and Paul Rosenberg, just trying to salvage, to use his analogy, the damage from the grenade that Joe threw on Everyday Struggle in 2017. Yeah. And he also tells Kweli, just for what it's worth, we reported this on AFH, the album, by Crook's estimation, was done. You could have made an album out of it, he says. And he says, one member said, I don't have time to do it this summer. Let's talk in November. Then November comes around and it's like, you know what? I can't do it now. I think he's referring to Joe there.
Yeah, I think, who else would it be? Royce is busy working on things. Crook is busy too, but they've shown themselves to be able to do multiple projects at one time. I think Joe, because he's now down to 2 shows, I don't think State of the Culture is still on at this point. but he's got multiple irons in the fire.
Mhm.
You know, I think they're in the Spotify deal at this point. You know, they got the business of that.
He's an
He's got,
executive at Patreon. Yeah.
yeah, he's got a lot going on. So, you know, I think he's probably the most likely candidate.
So then 2020. Oh, go ahead.
And so then Crook was like, it started being like, this ain't gonna happen. You know, I just feel like it was robbing the culture. You know, so you know, there are a lot of things. Joe's retirement from rap, his being busy and things like that, that are indicators that this album is just never gonna come out. It's not gonna happen. And again, this is gonna play a role in the conversation that we'll talk about.
2020. It's hard to remember it pre-pandemic, but those first 3 months. Eminem released Music to Be Murdered By, and there's one song, I Will, that features Slaughterhouse, not listed as Slaughterhouse, but it features Crook, Joell, and Royce, no Joe Budden. And in that song, Joe has the line, your group is off the chain, but you're the weakest link. Joe Budden makes it a point to say that he doesn't think that lyric is about him, presuming that it's about Lord Jamar regarding Brand Nubian. Later, elsewhere on the album,
wait, you said Joe says that. Who said it? Was that Joell or was that?
Oh, that's an M bar.
Oh, got it. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Sorry. And elsewhere on the album, though, and you and I, covered this on the site. M does have some wordplay where he refers to Trader Joe, like traitor, and that's when Joe again responds. And just kind of laughs on his podcast that M would take it so personally.
Yeah. So now we're
okay. One other point of note. Sorry about that. Later that year, and this is what's happening in 2022. Kxng Crooked and Joell release H.A.R.D at Mellow Music Group. It's an 8-song project, but clearly these two guys are going to continue the legacy of the group. They're going to split off into 2. There's no mention of Slaughterhouse in the titling or anything like that. I actually don't even recall what the acronym stands for, but these two guys, continue to do what they do best and bar it up. And if I'm not mistaken, it's talked about, at least on the Joe Budden podcast, in passing, of like, yo, that's out, check it out, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And so, for guys who have not made an album in like 7-8 years now, at this point, there is a lot of chatter for a group that says they don't want to work together. I think that obviously part of that's driven by the media, who I'm sure is asking these guys every time they have an interview about Slaughterhouse. But even then, if there's not a desire, if there's not a feeling like we haven't fulfill the potential, the promise of what we have, both in terms of getting this Glass House album out, and also, potentially working on new material. If there isn't that feeling, I think it's just like, hey, everybody's busy, and maybe we'll get to it at some point, maybe not. It's just a quick aside. But the revelation of all the feelings, I think, reflects both the crazy stuff that went down with the Budden and Eminem feud, but also just this feeling like you've had something that was taken away from you and didn't, get its chance to like fully realize its potential. That's a different kind of disappointment, a different kind of pain. So 2021 comes.
2 things happened behind the scene that we don't know, that we didn't know about until this week. And obviously, because the public wasn't made aware, there could be more sides to this story than we've had. But behind the scenes, the 4 members of Slaughterhouse acquired the rights to the group. I take that to mean they got off of Shady. Slaughterhouse is back to an independent entity. I don't think any of the 4 members tweeted that news. There wasn't a press release that I recall. That came up this week. And then the other thing that we learned this week is that somewhere on 2020 and during 2021, Westside Gunn, who put out multiple projects, as you and I both know, wanted to reunite Slaughterhouse as a guest. And in a conversation that we're about to pivot towards, Joe Budden said that he was down. He just wanted to spend some days or weeks in the studio with Royce, kind of, practicing, chiseling up. But by the time that the conversation had advanced, Westside Gunn, maybe didn't change his mind, but had moved in another direction.
Yeah. So 2022 comes, and we're early, right? We're in March now, so there's not a lot that could have unfolded, but there are two things that happened that sparked a lot of Slaughterhouse conversation and really led to this podcast. So Joell and Crooked form a group, and they are making an album that we talked about. It's coming out on March 11th. That is called The Rise and Fall of Slaughterhouse. And they released a single. I forget what the single's called. You remember? Vacancy. And it is detailing, kind of the history and, the bad blood or the disputes that have led to what they say is the fall of Slaughterhouse. At this point, it has definitely got some things that are provocative. I don't think there's anything that is disrespectful, but there are definitely things that, like, if you heard it and you're, the person that's being directed to, you might feel a way about it, especially with it being aired publicly in a song. And then they go and they do they have a conversation on video where they further start to discuss the project and what happened with Slaughterhouse.
They're doing a webisodic series called Foreclosure, spelled F-O-U-R, alluding to the four members. Also, Crook and Joell had each, I can't believe I'm saying this as a man in his upper 30s, but they changed their Instagram avatars to upside down flaming pigs, the Slaughterhouse logo. In the first video, they meet in California to go eat fittingly barbecue. And, it's very cheeky, designed to, I think, do just that, bring closure. I agree with what you said, Reggie. I watched it. If I'm Joe or Royce or I don't know that I feel any type of way strongly, but I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, and then the second song comes out on Friday. And you want to talk about that one too?
Yeah, the second song, just so I get the title right, and the first one, for those that want to hear, it's an article on the site. It's also on our playlist at present. We thought it was super duper narrative. But the second song is called Backstage, which is interesting because it alludes to how the group had this chemistry backstage, but that behind the scenes, which I think is where the title also comes from, when they went home, they went home. I mean, these were not guys that were always necessarily checking in on each other. And it's interesting that, Joell is one of the members of the group, and you've heard from Joe, you've heard from Royce. Joell doesn't seem like he has a ton of contact with those two guys. At one point, Royce has said that he and Crook used to text every day. You heard Crook tell Drink Champs he and Royce were kind of the showrunners of that third album. But that this project shows that, hey, maybe this familial bond wasn't what the public thought it was.
And so the other big thing that comes out in that song is that apparently there was a deal on the table for a new Slaughterhouse album. And Joell and Crooked say that both Royce and Budden turned down the deal. And that set the stage for what happened on Friday night. And, we wanted to lay out this extensive history for two reasons. One, Slaughterhouse is an incredibly important group to our audience. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been a definitive time like this before. And I think it's important. But secondly, we really wanted to give you in-depth context for this conversation that happened on Friday night, because there's a lot of stuff that starts to make a lot more sense once you know the history of what has happened with this group, in order to kind of piece together what happened. So Crook and Joell now have two songs out that are talking about the rise and fall of Slaughterhouse. And they also have a video series that they're doing too. Royce and Budden had both voiced their displeasure with the way that this whole album was being rolled out, and I think even the existence of the album. But they had done so on social media. They haven't rapped or anything like that. But it's been sparing. There had not been anything extensive. Friday night, however, Royce got on IG Live. And, for those who tune into us or tune into them, to Royce, they know that Royce has kind of made IG Live what Budden has made his podcast into. It's his platform. He's a master at using IG Live to get out things, be provocative, and put out inspirational and provocative conversation. And he did that masterfully last year with a conversation that went on for months between him and Lupe Fiasco that involved Mickey Fax and Ransom and
Math Hoffa and
RJ Payne and, a lot of folks and three. And, it culminated in a series of battle records. Royce dropped the first one, and I'll call his a battle record. This is him just kind of like putting it out there that he's here and he hears dudes talking and he's still got those bars. He's not just going to just talk about everything. And Lupe returns with a very personal record, which attacks Royce a number of times, talks about him being in the shadow of Eminem and, critiques his rap style, like really, really kind of goes in. And then Royce has a conversation on IG Live again and is joined by Mickey Fax. And there's a line that Royce had put in his song about how it was a bar directed towards someone's son chips was the line. And Mickey was like, was that about me? Because I'm the only one in this group that has a son. And Royce says, well, you know what, Mickey, if you want that line, then yeah, you can have that line. That line's for you. And they get into like a back and forth, and Budden joins that IG Live, and together they kind of sun Mickey a little bit, or attempt to sun Mickey a little bit. They talk about how Mickey hasn't been in the same circles that they have. He hasn't been in the studio with the kind of giants that they have to put that kind of pressure on his pen.
Checked all the boxes.
Doesn't check the boxes. Mickey then goes in the lab and returns with what I think is not only the best diss record of 2021, I would say it's a top 10 diss record of all time. I feel that strongly about it. Where he goes, he references the entire social media history between Lupe, Royce, and him. He goes in depth with that. He must have watched that conversation a bunch of times because he checks all the boxes that are discussed in that conversation. He mimics RJ Payne and Ransom to throw some more disses. He uses samples from Renegade. Like, it just is a phenomenally crafted song. But I say all this to say that IG Live has been a space that Royce has used to foster conversation, to respond to things that are happening into the culture, to respond to like diss songs and things like that. So fast forward to Friday night, 2022, Royce is on IG Live and he starts talking about what's been happening with Joell and Crook. And this is his platform now. So for about 8 minutes or so, he is just talking and responding to questions and things like that about his feelings about it. And this is all on ambrosiaforheads.com. Jake wrote a phenomenal article. We're not going to quote extensively from that call now because the entire thing is laid out magnificently on the site. But we're going to talk about the themes that occurred during the call because it was one of the more intense exchanges I've seen since that time that Royce and Lupe were going at it, and Mickey and things like that. But I would say much more meaningful this time because this is about a group that everyone has cared about and loved for the better part of 12 years now, really having group therapy, group family disagreement, and like pulling back the curtains and letting the world in on it. So about 8 minutes in, Joe Budden joins the call with Royce, and it starts with laughter and them kind of lamenting the state where they are. Both are just scratching their head, wondering how it came to this. Why are these dudes doing this publicly now? Why not just have a conversation? And the thing they say is that that really makes it ironic is that a 4-person reunion was really in the works. This is what they're saying. And for the first time, we as fans are hearing now that Joe Budden had agreed to rap. Jake mentioned the West Side Gun track and that they were supposed to rap on that never materialized. And I wonder if that was for Gun or was going to be Griselda and Slaughterhouse, which would have fulfilled my TDE versus Slaughterhouse fantasy in terms of just hearing like some of the most gifted dudes in the game just like going at it on wax, which would have been absolutely incredible. But Budden says very clearly a number of times that his retirement was really a public thing that he was saying, but behind the scenes, he was always saying to the other members of Slaughterhouse that, I will rap again. I'm just never going to rap again for Shady Records. He didn't
Not
like
over there.
he didn't like the economic structure. He didn't like, apparently the politics of the creative control, with the beat selection and the direction of like how the album should go. And, to his point, it hadn't worked out for them. And, as we said earlier, the reason why we planted this seed was ownership. Budden is a guy who has, for a number of years now, spoken about the importance of ownership, not just about music, but about all of his intellectual property. And the reason why that the Everyday Struggle show, as big as it was, and the reason why he left that show is because he wanted ownership of his platform. He wanted his just due. It wasn't just about like upfront financial compensation. He wanted a piece of the economics of it. And so when they didn't do it, he left and continued to build his own platform. He then went to Spotify and offered and received a very nice bag from them. But once again, when it came up for contract renewal, he wanted the same kind of numbers that Joe Rogan and others had gotten from Spotify, but he also wanted ownership of his own intellectual property, and they were not willing to give that. And so he left and rebuilt on Patreon, and where presumably he owns, the rights to his own thing. He's done the same thing with the Pull Up. Ownership has become a consistent theme in his narrative as an artist and as a business person who builds on his own intellectual property. It's a critical thing for him. So it's not surprising that he would not want to be in a situation where he didn't have some level of ownership. And, we're going to talk about that in this conversation in a minute too. So Royce starts to talk about how the group has evolved over time, and it's really dissolved over time. So he says that he and Crook, were, good friends, and that the notion in the song that they, just kind of like parted ways after working together on tours and stuff like that was not true, because reality is that he says that he and Crooked used to text to each other every single day. But, they're now at a point where Crook does not return his texts, and Royce is starting to think, that maybe that's because Cook was cooking this up with Joell. That might be part of it. You got something to say?
And then, there's one more point, and it's not in the article, but AFH had covered it. Royce has a studio in Detroit called Heaven, and Royce welcomed Crook's brother, who's part of COB, and produced their project. I'm not sure that it's out, but Royce, stayed active with Crook on a one-to-one level. And from what he even said during that conversation, presented that project to Eminem, who also took interest and was like, wow, these guys are really cool. I think M may have even produced a joint for COB, but just underpins your point of these guys being in touch. Royce, worked with Joell on the Mona Lisa album that we had talked about earlier, but yeah.
Yeah. And so, Royce and Budden's point during the conversation is that Crook and Joell's song is really filled with lies and half-truths, it comes out that most of their disagreements, and we can see this now, were about business, and part of it might be a difference in philosophies. So, Budden is saying things that suggest that Joell and Crook had different financial incentives. He's suggesting they were looking for, advances and record deals, possibly from majors. So kind of upfront money. Whereas, he and Royce were focused more on ownership and independence. So, we talked about Budden and his path. In the background, Royce has now also built up a really great track record of controlling his own economic direction, and it also is artistic freedom. All those albums we mentioned, the Prime albums, the Book of Ryan, Layers, like all these albums, Allegory
yeah.
were put out independently. And Royce, presumably took, much smaller advances, had much smaller budgets, but the benefit is that the financial upside is then yours. And again, you have creative control and there's ownership of your product. And so, the implication is that Crooked and Joell were more into the traditional label model of you get an advance, label owns everything. They have more say in what your creative output is and things like that. And so if that's true, then you can understand how that would create a fundamental kind of impasse in terms of how you would proceed as a collective unit. Because if one half wants one structure, another half wants a structure that's the antithesis of that, then, it's very, very tough. Royce in particular had issues with Crooked and Joell putting out images of the pig logo burning, like you mentioned. And he said that's really like burning down your own house, because first of all, the Slaughterhouse logo is owned by, or is representative of all four of them, right? It is not just two people, it's the four of them. And so to the extent you're going to actually do something that damages that logo, damages that brand, you're damaging something you've built, something that reflects you too. And so he doesn't even understand the logic of that.
Yeah, I mean, and RZA and Wu-Tang have been the same with their brand, and there have been times where affiliates like and I'm just speculating, but like a Shaheem or a lot of the Dark Man or Sons of Man have tried to use the Wu logo, and RZA and his business partners have been very protective of you're not just gonna use that without consequence. And I mean, different legacies, but Slaughterhouse, I kind of get that point from Royce personally.
Yeah. And, Royce and Joe also suggest that, Crook and Joell are doing this album, this project for a bag. And they're saying that, this actually crosses a line. Everyone has done things for money at a time. And obviously art is done for money. But there's a difference between, putting out what is truly representative of who you are, what you believe and what you think, versus doing something that is going out, and disrespectful of truth, of context, of relationships and history in order to get money. And this is what they're suggesting. Again, this is us paraphrasing this, but I will put a link we'll have a link in the description to this so you can read the quotes for yourself. And, I believe that we are objectively representing what was conveyed here. And I think the quotes will back us up.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing. I know I said I can see where Royce is coming from about the logo. It was Joe that makes the speculation that, maybe the needs are different surrounding ownership. And that is purely speculation from what I know, but when you start talking about, doing it for the bag, there's a very interesting point of the call where Royce, and it really harkened back to that conversation that Joe and Royce had with Mickey last year, where you said, they at least attempted to kind of sun him, was the word you used. Royce brings up a record that Joell had made in 2019 with Salam Remy called Je'llo. And Joe and Royce proceed to laugh at a piece of art that Joell Ortiz has made. Like, it starts to get personal. And Royce goes on to say, and there's a direct quote in the story, that, I'm Grammy nominated because I make music with my heart. And he kind of shrugs to say that if you do something like that, you see what it gets you. So there really is a chasm between, at least on Royce's part, creatively, him and Crook and Joell. And then Joe is alluding to it in the deal points, or at least in ownership, that there's a chasm between him and Royce and Crook and Joell, business-wise or perhaps financially.
Yeah, I mean, during that conversation about Je'llo, there's a point where Budden is laughing that he so hard that he actually covers the camera, and they both suggest that Joell did that record for the bag. It was like, if you know Joell, you listen to his music and you hear that, you understand that that's not who he is. That's an interesting statement, because I think that one could also say that about them in respect to that the official Slaughterhouse album. If you're on the outside looking in and you hear that commercial, album, I think that most Slaughterhouse fans could think that that was done for the bag instead of what they truly wanted to represent as artists. So I don't know, just interesting reflection. I'm not suggesting one way or another, but I guess you never question like a person's intent unless you know it. But so at one point in the conversation, Joe asks Royce if he would ever rap with them again, given everything that's kind of transpired over these last couple of weeks. And Royce says he would never say never, but right now he doesn't see the purpose in rapping with them again. So he's not saying that it'll never happen, but I guess unless something fundamentally changes, there's no real reason for him to rap with them again. You can tell that he's definitely not happy with what's happened. And so at this point, and now this is like an hour or so into the conversation of a 90-minute conversation, they get Royce gets a notice that Joell Ortiz wants to join. And so Joell comes in, and Joell's a dude who's not heavy on social media. He doesn't get into all this. He kind of makes his work and then goes about his business. He's a family man. We know this, haven't spoken to him. He's about the work and, not the stuff around that. But he comes in because he said, yo, people are blowing him up and, saying these guys are, and he says, I'm watching, y'all are calling us liars. Like off the rip, he says that y'all are calling us liars. And Roy says, well, y'all are lying. They're not mincing words, that like off the rip, these guys are just saying what they think about one another. And so they get into it. And Joell's biggest issue is that Royce and Budden are saying they didn't turn down a record deal. And he says they're incorrect in that, and saying that, what he and so that's part of why he and Crook are doing this, is because they had tried for quite some time to like get the group together, and they had a deal on the table. And, once that deal was put forward, and I suppose it was a good deal, it was rejected. And so then they get into detail, and Royce keeps saying to him throughout, why are you saying we turned the deal down? We never turned the deal down. And Joell says, okay, well, listen, Royce, we came to you, pitched this, and you said you refused to do it without Joe, which I think is interesting because, you point out that Mona Lisa record that had Joell, Crook, and Royce. Clearly they're willing to work together on an individual song. So I wonder what the hesitation was for an album.
Yeah, they did it on Em's album too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess you can say the argument is that a song is one thing, but to do a project that's a state without someone, that's a statement. You want to support your brothers and do songs together and stuff like that, but doing an entire album is kind of a statement. But then to your point, the House Rules mixtape was only a few songs of them collectively, and then 4 songs of them individually. And so, but Royce says, listen, neither one of us ever explicitly refused to do it, because apparently Royce said he wasn't going to do it without Joe. And so then Joell talked to to Joe, and they had a good conversation, and Joell laid the deal out for Joe, and Joe apparently said, okay, cool, I'm with it. And he said he's going to call Crook afterwards to talk to him and find out more specifics about the deal. But then that call supposedly never happened, and this is over the course of, I'm trying to figure out the timeline. It can't be more than a year, because we know that they negotiated the release of themselves from Shady within the last year. And so this call has not happened yet. You're going to say something.
Well, yeah. And just for anyone who didn't read the article, they do confirm that the deal was on behalf of a major label. They don't specify who, but the deal was coming from somebody named Tony Boucher, if I'm saying that right, who's not somebody I know. But I did look, he's the CEO, I believe it's called Hitmaker Entertainment. And that is the company that Kxng Crooked has used to put out projects in recent years, as well as his Crook's Corner YouTube series, his webisodic interview series. And according to Joe and Royce, Tony had done some bad business with somebody, according to them. So they were very, very particular about where the ownership was going to be. Royce at one point says, you're sucking all the black ownership out of the deal for an advance. So, there's that element too. And both of them allege this rise and fall of Slaughterhouse is coming out through this company, Hitmaker. And they're saying this gentleman has done his histories and playlisting. So you're already inflating your numbers on, you know, the foreclosure webisode series, which at this point is 2 episodes. So it's just interesting context to bring in there. And Joe's point is, I never got the deal memo. I raised questions. I, you know, couldn't have this conversation that I wanted to with Crook, but I never got the deal memo to proceed. That's why we're at this impasse.
Yeah, Royce says there was no deal memo, and yeah, they allege that he inflated numbers. The person that you just mentioned, and Royce says that that's damaging to the brand, the Slaughterhouse brand. You know, so Joell says, "Yo, this is the most dialogue Slaughterhouse has had in years." You know, and he says, "Where was all this energy when, you know, we were trying to save the group?" And he's asking why they're doing this publicly, you know, which is a question I had too. It's an ironic question though, because the mere fact of the existence of this album is they're publicly airing like kind of their business. So, you know, I don't think it's out of step for Royce and Joe to respond publicly in kind via social media, which is, you know, one of Royce's preferred ways of like advancing dialogue right now. And you know, a couple minutes later, Budden says, and this is a direct quote, you know, expletives included because of the power, "Joell Ortiz, you are a fucking liar." He says that dead to his face. And like at that point, I'm thinking, wow, okay, it's really about to go down. But surprisingly, Joell doesn't react. He doesn't like lose it based on that comment, you know. And then Royce starts to press him, and he's been doing this throughout the call. When did Joe turn down the deal? And Joell says numerous occasions, and you know, but he doesn't ever cite a specific instance where Budden explicitly said, "I'm not doing this deal." Now, you know, to his credit, like if you take the context, some of the context, right, that Joe has said he's retired. He's now been presented a few different deals and he's not done them. He said he doesn't want a certain ownership structure, and the deal you're presenting to him is the ownership structure that he does not want. Then one can conclude, okay, he's not going to have this deal. Now, you know, from Joe and Royce's perspective, Royce hasn't turned it down. He just says he wants to do it with Joe. And Joe hasn't necessarily turned it down. He might have said he didn't want that economic structure, but that doesn't mean that they can't at some point over time come to an agreement. The other thing is that their timetables might be different. You know, Joell and Crook might think 8-9 months have passed, you're not interested. For Joe and Royce, it could be they got other projects going on. So it might be a year or 2 or 3 down the road, but at some point they'll work it out. But you know, that's when Budden calls Joell a liar. You know, he's with, you know, Joell saying that he turned down the deal. So Royce asked then, you know, a really interesting question. He says, what was the purpose of them spending all that time? And you got to think that you're spending that time and legal fees. It's a lot of money too, to get off Shady Records if they weren't going to relaunch the group, right? And that's a fair question. You know, why would they spend all this time, you know, and, you know, if Budden if what he says is true, that behind the scenes, he's been telling these dudes he's not retired, he's just not doing business with Shady, then there's a lot of reason to think, okay, you know, maybe they will, but, you know, this just isn't the right time or the right structure. And then Royce says that he thinks that Joell and Crook are doing this to get traffic to their album, and that's at the brand's expense. And Joe, you know, chimes in that they're exploiting and it's nasty. You know, so Joell again says we could have done all this behind the scenes. Again, you know, tough comment to make when you're coming out with a public album. And Joe says the logo was not theirs to burn. And then Joel asks what he says it was, and asks whose was it. So, you know, what's your take on that? We've seen a lot of artists over the years who have been part of a group who, when they split up, then go on to do songs. Sometimes they'll use a name, sometimes it'll be of, you know, this group, you know.
Happens all the time, man.
Do you think that, you know, individuals of a group have the right, you know, let's put aside legal, right? Let's just think about like a principle, the right to use the logo, the name of a brand that they co-created.
I think there's cases where it works. Brand Nubian, after Grand Poobah steps away for those couple albums, of course, is Brand Nubian. And I feel like fans at the time knew what they were getting. Where it gets tricky is you see those projects, 3-6 Mafia and Bone Thugs and Harmony have ironically done it, where, two or more members are missing in the group and you'll still see a project. And I don't ever really see those projects going on to, being great things later in life. When everyone's reunited, then they kind of become this ugly stepchild. And yeah, I totally see Royce and Joe's point on that one.
Yeah, and I think burning it is fire in the stadium. I think that's just a different level of provocativeness, and I think that whether or not you're doing it to like get the clicks, I think you have to know as an artist and as savvy as these guys are that this is going to provoke a reaction and get that kind of response. And so, it's a tough thing to do for a brand, and I can understand why it would be upsetting. So then Royce says, he kind of details the structure of the deal, and he says that the deal on the table was the major label and with advances. And we now know, and Budden again, has been living this truth for the last several years, but he also explicitly stated it in that pull-up that you quoted from, back in, I think, 2019, that he wasn't interested in deals with advances. Now, maybe there's a number that's big enough, but, Budden also said that he is bigger than anything they have going on. And that's not disrespect to, well, it was said in a way that could be perceived as being disrespectful to Joell.
It's hugely disrespectful.
Yeah, it was very disrespectful the way that it was said. But you step back, right? Again, putting the Eminem, the Joe like take on Eminem's. He said something that in a way that was very disrespectful, but also could be true, right? We don't know the amount of money that was being offered from the that they have going on. I take that it could mean two things, right? It could mean he's bigger than Joell and Crook, which would be supremely disrespectful, or it could mean that he's bigger than the number that they brought to the table, which might be factual. It might be factual that he has from his podcast deal and other things going on. He's dealing with numbers that such that he would not take time away from his bag from those things in order to do a project with that.
I mean, you make a valid point. It could go either way. And there's something that Joe says, and we'll talk about it in a second, that leads me to believe it's one of the two definitively. But also, let me just play devil's advocate for a second. Is Joe Budden in 2017 and early 2018 going at Slaughterhouse's investor and backer at the time, Eminem, which, in kind, which elevates his platforms, be it Everyday Struggle or the Joe Budden podcast, any different than Joell Ortiz and Kxng Crooked taking the logo and the name of their project and these videos and arguably fleecing the brand that way?
I think it's different. He's going at Eminem because of an economic disagreement. So he is definitely damaging behind the scenes their relationship and their ability to work with Shady Records. So he's definitely negatively affecting the bag of his group. Mm-hmm. But the converse is that he might be doing so because he fundamentally believes that if they do it the way that he thinks they should do it, they will get a bigger bag in the end. That could be his belief. But whatever, that's still like going to Eminem, and that's putting tension, but he's not publicly burning the brand. I don't now if Em was part of Slaughterhouse, then I'd say yes, because but he's not going at members of Slaughterhouse, he's going to Em, who's the label owner.
But if you're Crook or Joell at that time, Joe's single-handed decision, which arguably elevates his platform, is going to financially and legacy-wise affect you. Like, I know that there were 3 to 4 years where we did not get that Slaughterhouse album, but it didn't seem like Joe doing that at the time was going to make that a reality either. It almost kind of put that notion to bed. I'm not saying any bias, just objectively, it's interesting that there's two different tactics that have the same consequences.
So fundamentally agree that he is, really effing with their money, right? And he's also potentially preventing them from doing things to further augment the brand in the future. He is not, though, doing stuff that destroys or potentially takes away from what they've done in the past. I think setting a brand on fire is, taken away from what they've done in the past. It's burning, it's literally burning down the house they built.
Yeah.
One is like saying, I'm not going to let us remodel. We're not going to reconstruct. We're not going to buy a new house. Another's burning down the house. So that's my take on it. Royce says that the deals with advances. My takeaway is that both sides are telling the truth, and they're kind of missing each other. So, Royce and Budden never explicitly verbally turned down the deal, it seems. At least Joell didn't come out with the time they did. He used circumstantial evidence to present his case. Royce isn't going to do it without Joe. Joe's not going to do it unless it's to his liking. It's not to his liking, so dudes aren't going to do the deal. Whereas I think that Royce and Budden were like, we're going to do it, but it needs to be right. Let's take some time and make it right. And, maybe it's going to take longer than this year. Joell keeps asking, what is it that was going to happen within, in this time that didn't happen? And maybe there's not a satisfactory answer to that, but maybe the answer is that it's going to take more than a year. Maybe it's going to take 2-3 years, but no one ever actually said we're not going to do the deal. Budden again, talks about Joell's numbers being fake and boosted. Then they'd also talked about, were they going to release a joint album, Royce and Budden to go against like Joell and Crook? Was this part of it? Royce laughed this off earlier in the conversation. Then Joe again talks about the mess that was Slaughterhouse with the politics, and he wanted no part of it until they were off Shady. And Joell doesn't refute this. He doesn't ever say, Joe, you're lying about that. So to me, it suggests that Budden was being on the up and up about saying, listen, y'all know what the deal was behind the scenes. I was saying this because it's what it was, and so you got something to say to that?
Well, that's happening and things keep escalating. And you're right. I mean, when Joe says I'm bigger than, that, it doesn't get the inflection point that I thought it would when I was watching it in real time. But there's another exchange that happens, which leads me to believe that Joe's point was more, it was bigger than other members, where, he tells Joell, you're not good. And Joell says, I'm good. And Joe goes, no, you're not. No, you're not. And they're talking over each other. And that's where this conversation really starts to go towards the cliff.
Yeah. So, Joell asked him what was going to happen that didn't yet happen, in this past year, because Joe keeps saying, I didn't say it. So it's like, okay, so then what was going to happen? Joe doesn't respond. He walks away from the camera, he comes back and he says, I wish you guys the best, but he doesn't respond. He doesn't ever say what would it take to move them past this impasse of what the economic structure is. He said, well, if you wish me the best, then, you should support me. And Budden asks, what do you mean? And he says, you should, F with the album and tell the people to support it. And at this point, Budden says, and it was hard to hear because it's a heated moment and they're both kind of talking a little bit over each other. Budden says, Joell, that album can S my D. And Joell replies, N S my D. So, Joe says the album can suck it. Joell tells Joe to suck it. And so to me, I think he thought that Budden had told him to suck it. And we know from 3 6 Mafia and Bone Thugs and Harmony that that doesn't fly well. That can lead to fisticuffs, like, in an event. And then Budden says, "You want me to support that clown-ish?" It is a strange request, right? It is very, very strange for someone to ask someone to support a record that they haven't heard yet, but the two songs they have heard are saying things that you believe to be fundamentally untrue and disrespectful and unrepresentative of you. That's a hard ask, right? And Joel says, "Yo, Joe, that little comment right there, you're gonna wish you retracted that one." I'm not. You're gonna wish you retracted that one. He said, "I'm out." One, and hangs up. Now, it's interesting. This is a very, very interesting point because, I'm wondering, is it possible that, this was all orchestrated? We're dealing with 4 incredibly savvy artists, one who has participated in a social media, in Royce, IG live, like weeks on end, ongoing conversation that resulted in one of the biggest moments of the year, the culminating of the 3 records that he, Lupe and Roy and Mickey put out. And I think that people talked about the 3 of them more last year than they had in quite some time. And it was a result of all the stuff that went down. Now you have an album called The Rise and Fall of Slaughterhouse. And, Joell and Crook accuse Budden of not having supported them in the past. What better way to get support than to do this in person? So I want to talk about, do you think that this was real?
I do. I think that this project from Crook and Joell started as an igniter, kindling towards, we'll get this project off the ground. That seems like that has been Crook's modus operandi for the last 4 years. Let's get this album out there. And, they put out the H.A.R.D project. Cool. Gets a little bit of mention maybe on the Joe Budden podcast, maybe a retweet or a share from Royce. Now they're going far more on the nose with it. But the way that it's being handled, they're now kind of disrupting the universe. And the way that conversation ended on Friday night, I think this is real. I think this is very, very real. I would still venture to bet that I think we will get new music from these 4 MCs together in the next 5 years. But right now, I think this is real, and it really kind of shakes up the group. I mean, this is a lot of promotion, both for the project that Crook and Joell are doing, as well as just Slaughterhouse on a whole. And as you and I can prove over these last few hours, like, people still are invested.
Yeah, I think it's real too. I think it's complicated. I think that if your desire was to get a reaction and make this a really big album, I think it is going to be much bigger than it would have been if they just dropped it without all the fanfare. It certainly would have gotten a reaction, just the fact that they're talking about this group that people love. But there have been solo records in the past. I think Joell had a record where he talked about the breakdown of the group. I think Crook might have too, that have come and gone and haven't gotten this kind of reaction. But I think now that it's been aired publicly like this, and there's been a conversation, I think that it's going to be much bigger than it was before. So in some ways, again, I think this is Royce and Joe doing their part to help actually push the project in an ironic way. But I think that the things that were said and all the context we did, for the purpose of really, filling in the gaps and the behind the scenes on what was discussed. I think that's all real. I think Budden doesn't like that ownership structure. I think that he wasn't going to accept a deal of that nature unless the numbers either came up to the point where it was surpassing or equal to the opportunities he has on the table now, or the structure was different. I do think that Royce wouldn't do an album without Joe because he probably feels like that's just loyal to the group and to the brand, and he holds both dear. And I think that Crook and Joell legitimately believed that because of that, nothing was going to change and it was never going to happen. And so they felt justified in doing what they do. I think that all the feelings were real. Everything they said was real. But I also think that nothing was done without knowing that this was going to light a tinderbox and result in tremendous promotion, which, also plays into what Royce said about it being done to traffic the album, what Budden said about it being, nasty. And yeah, I think all those things are true.
I have a theory about this that we'll know if it's real if Joe and Royce discuss it further. The cruelest thing that they could do is let it end on Friday night. And I looked before we started taping this morning just to make sure everything was caught up, on the social end. And Joe tapes his show on Fridays, that runs on Saturdays. He has for years. So there was nothing new there. But I have a suspicion that if this is real, they won't mention it again. The worst thing you can do is not bring attention to it or not think about it. If the next few episodes of the Joe Budden podcast or Royce keeps jumping up on IG Live, then we'll know. Because honestly, they don't stand anything to gain short term by talking about it. But long term, if this group is to go forth and it elevates their various platforms, you'll see it.
Yeah, I don't think it matters if they talk about it again or not because, it's out there now. The hype, I think everyone's going to want to hear what Joell and Crook have to say. So they've done their job in, promoting it. They could obviously extend the conversation if they continued it. But, I agree with your point also that this is likely not the last we're going to hear of them. Life is long and we've seen much worse disputes between groups, get navigated. They've had to do that, with the stuff that Joe did with Em, and seemed like they got to a place where they were going to do it, and the business made sense. So I think they'll get past this too. Part of me hopes that this is all an elaborate ploy for them to drop a full-blown Slaughterhouse album on Friday, and that would be like some social commentary on our need to pick things apart and bathe in the negativity, because if they just dropped an album without this fanfare, everyone receiving it would be cool, but now it would be the biggest thing ever. But I just don't think that's going to happen. But if it did, it would be dope. But in any case, I do think that we'll hear from the four of them together at some point.
Man, if it does, you better buy a lottery ticket because you're calling an orchestrated play.
Word, for sure. I had to drop that in just in case.
Yeah,
to validate the rest of the podcast if it happens.
Yeah. Word.
You got anything else on this?
No, I think it's interesting. It's wild. Part of me keeps asking myself, what is the listen back value of a project that chronicles the rise and fall of a group? But I've been watching the Kanye West documentary on Netflix, the Genius joint, and he made Diamonds of Sierra Leone, which chronicled the rise and fall of Rockefeller. The best song the DOC ever made after his first album was Ruthless to Death Row. I still listen to these songs because it is storytelling, and I think it's a compelling thing, like you said. On Friday, I intend to listen, and man, oh man, if you're right, that would be crazy.
Word. So, I think we keep this one strictly the Slaughterhouse. But
I agree.
That being said, what's your song of the week?
It's apropos. I've mentioned it a couple times. I'm going to go with the Kick Drums remix of Move On by Slaughterhouse. What about you?
I'm going to go with House Rules, man. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, man. I think this is a new record for us, but it's a worthy group. For anyone that's made it this far, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get this. Let us know. Leave comments. We do this for that, but we really appreciate y'all.
Word, indeed.
All right. Until next time.
Word. Till next time. Peace.